Section I. Of an Inquiry into the Causes and Effects of the Variolae Vaccinae. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jordan Watts, Oxfordshire. An Inquiry into the Causes and Effects of the Variolae Vaccinae by Edward Jenner, M.D., F.R.S., etc. Publication I. An Inquiry into the Causes and Effects of the Variolae Vaccinae, a disease discovered in some of the western counties of England, particularly Gloucestershire, and known by the name of the cow pox. Quid nobis certius ipsis sensibus esse potest, qui vera ac falsa notemus. Lucretius. To the King. Sir, when I first addressed the public on a physiological subject, which I conceived to be of the utmost importance to the future welfare of the human race, I could not presume, in that early stage of the investigation, to lay the result of my inquiries at your Majesty's feet. Subsequent experiments, instituted not only by myself, but by men of the first rank in the medical profession, have now confirmed the truth of the theory which I first made known to the world. Highly honoured by the permission to dedicate the result of my inquiries to your Majesty, I am emboldened to solicit your gracious patronage of a discovery which reason fully authorises me to suppose will prove peculiarly conducive to the preservation of the lives of mankind. To a monarch no less justly than emphatically styled the father of his people, this treatise is inscribed with perfect propriety. For, conspicuous as your Majesty's patronage has been of arts, of science, and of commerce, yet the most distinguished feature of your character is your paternal care for the dearer interests of humanity. I am, Sir, with the most profound respect, your Majesty's most devoted subject and servant, Edward Jenner. Berkeley, Gloucestershire, December 20th, 1799. An Inquiry, etc., etc. The deviation of man from the state in which he was originally placed by nature seems to have proved to him a prolific source of diseases. From the love of splendour, from the indulgences of luxury, and from his fondness for amusement, he has familiarised himself with a great number of animals, which may not originally have been intended for his associates. The wolf, disarmed of ferocity, is now pillowed in the lady's lap. Footnote: the late Mr. John Hunter proved by experiments that the dog is the wolf in a degenerated state. The cat, the little tiger of our island, whose natural home is the forest, is equally domesticated and caressed. The cow, the hog, the sheep, and the horse are all, for a variety of purposes, brought under his care and dominion. There is a disease to which the horse, from his state of domestication, is frequently subject. The farriers have termed it the grease. It is an inflammation and swelling in the heel, accompanied at its commencement with small cracks or fissures, from which issues a limpid fluid, possessing properties of a very peculiar kind. This fluid seems capable of generating a disease in the human body, after it has undergone the modification I shall presently speak of, which bears so strong a resemblance to the small pox, that I think it highly probable it may be the source of that difeafe. In this dairy country a great number of cows are kept, and the office of milking is performed indifcriminately by men and maid servants. One of the former having been appointed to apply dreffings to the heels of a horse affected with the malady I have mentioned, and not paying due attention to cleanliness, incautiously bears his part in milking the cows, with some particles of the infectious matter adhering to his fingers. When this is the case, it frequently happens that a difeafe is communicated to the cows, and from the cows to the dairymaids, which spreads through the farm until most of the cattle and domeftics feel its unpleafant confequences. This difeafe has obtained the name of the cow pox. It appears on the nipples of the cows in the form of irregular puftules. At their firft appearance they are commonly of a palifh blue, or rather of a colour somewhat approaching to livid, and are surrounded by an inflammation. These pustules, unless a timely remedy be applied, frequently degenerate into phagedenic ulcers, which prove extremely troublesome. They who attend sick cattle in this country find a speedy remedy for stopping the progress of this complaint in those applications which act chemically upon the morbid matter, such as the solutions of the Vitriolum zinci, the Vitriolum cupri, etc. The animals become indisposed, and the secretion of milk is much lessened. Inflamed spots now begin to appear on different parts of the hands of the domestics employed in milking, and sometimes on the wrists, which run on to suppuration, first assuming the appearance of the small vesicles produced by a burn. Most commonly they appear about the joints of the fingers and at their extremities, but whatever parts are affected, if the situation will admit, these superficial suppurations put on a circular form, with their edges more elevated than their centre, and of a colour distantly approaching to blue. Absorption takes place, and tumours appear in each axilla. The system becomes affected, the pulse is quickened, shiverings succeeded by heat, general lassitude, and pains about the loins and limbs, with vomiting, come on. The head is painful, and the patient is now and then even affected with delirium. It will appear in the sequel that these symptoms arise principally from the irritation of the sores, and not from the primary action of the vaccine virus upon the constitution. These symptoms, varying in their degrees of violence, generally continue from 1 day to 3 or 4, leaving ulcerated sores about the hands, which, from the sensibility of the parts, are very troublesome, and commonly heal slowly, frequently becoming phagedenic, like thofe from whence they sprung. During the progress of the difeafe, the lips, nostrils, eyelids, and other parts of the body are fometimes affected with fores, but thefe evidently arife from their being heedlessly rubbed or fcratched with the patient's infected fingers. No eruptions on the skin have followed the decline of the feverifh symptoms in any inftance that has come under my infpection, one only excepted, and in this cafe a very few appeared on the arms. They were very minute, of a vivid red colour, and foon died away without advancing to maturation, fo that I cannot determine whether they had any connection with the preceding symptoms. Thus the difeafe makes its progrefs from the horfe, as I conceive, to the nipple of the cow, and from the cow to the human subject. Morbid matter of various kinds, when absorbed into the fyftem, may produce effects in fome degree fimilar, but what renders the Cow pox virus fo extremely singular is, that the perfon who has been thus affected is for ever after fecure from the infection of the Small Pox, neither expofure to the variolous effluvia, nor the infertion of the matter into the skin, producing this diftemper. In fupport of fo extraordinary a fadt, I fhall lay before my readers a great number of inftances. But firft it is neceffary to obferve, that puftulous fores frequently appear fpontaneoufly on the nipples of the cows, and inftances have occurred, though very rarely, of the hands of the fervants employed in milking being affected with fores in confequence, and even of their feeling an indifpofition from absorption. Thefe puftules are of a much milder nature than thofe which arife from that contagion which conftitutes the true Cow Pox. They are always free from the bluifh or livid tint fo confpicuous in the puftules in that difeafe. No eryfipelas attends them, nor do they shew any phagedenic difpofition, as in the other cafe, but quickly terminate in a scab without creating any apparent diforder in the cow. This complaint appears at various feafons of the year, but moft commonly in the fpring, when the cows are firft taken from their winter food and fed with grafs. It is very apt to appear alfo when they are fuckling their young. but this difeafe is not to be considered as fimilar in any refpect to that of which I am treating, as it is incapable of producing any fpecific effects on the human conftitution. However, it is of the greateft confequence to point it out here, left the want of difcrimination fhould occafion an idea of fecurity from the infection of the Small Pox, which might prove delufive. Case I. Joseph Merret, now an under gardener to the Earl of Berkeley, lived as a fervant with a farmer near this place in the year 1770, and occafionally affifted in milking his mafter's cows. Several horfes belonging to the farm began to have fore heels, which Merret frequently attended. The cows foon became affedted with the Cow Pox, and foon after feveral fores appeared on his hands. Swellings and ftiffnefs in each axilla followed, and he was fo much indifpofed for feveral days as to be incapable of purfuing his ordinary employment. Previoufly to the appearance of the diftemper among the cows there was no frefh cow brought into the farm, nor any fervant employed who was affedted with the Cow Pox. In April, 1795, a general inoculation taking place here, Merret was inoculated with his family, fo that a period of 25 years had elapsed from him having the Cow Pox to this time. However, though the variolous matter was repeatedly inferted into his arm, I found it impracticable to infect him with it, an efflorefcence only, taking on an eryfipelatous look about the centre, appearing on the fkin near the punctured parts. During the whole time that his family had the Small Pox, one of whom had it very full, he remained in the houfe with them, but received no injury from expofure to the contagion. It is neceffary to obferve, that the utmoft care was taken to ascertain, with the moft scrupulous precifion, that no one whofe cafe is here adduced had gone through the Small Pox previous to thefe attempts to produce that difeafe. Had thefe experiments been conducted in a large city, or in a populous neighbourhood, fome doubts might have been entertained; but here, where population is thin, and where fuch an event as a perfon having had the Small Pox is always faithfully recorded, no rifk of inaccuracy in this particular can arife. Case II. Sarah Portlock, of this place, was infedted with the Cow Pox when a fervant at a farmer's in the neighbourhood, 27 years ago. I have purpofely feledted feveral cafes in which the difeafe had appeared at a very diftant period previous to the experiments made with variolous matter, to shew that the change produced in the conftitution is not affedted by time. In the year 1792, conceiving herfelf, from this circumftance, fecure from the infection of the Small Pox, fhe nurfed one of her own children who had accidentally caught the difeafe, but no indifpofition enfued. During the time fhe remained in the infedted room, variolous matter was inferted into both her arms, but without any further effect than in the preceding cafe. Case III. John Phillips, a tradefman of this town, had the Cow Pox at fo early a period as 9 years of age. At the age of 62 I inoculated him, and was very careful in feledting matter in its moft active ftate. It was taken from the arm of a boy juft before the commencement of the eruptive fever, and inftantly inferted. It very speedily produced a fting-like feel in the part. An efflorefcence appeared, which on the 4th day was rather extenfive, and fome degree of pain and ftiffnefs were felt about the shoulder; but on the 5th day the fymptoms began to difappear, and in a day or two after went entirely off, without producing any effect on the fyftem. Case IV. Mary Barge, of Woodford, in this parifh, was inoculated with variolous matter in the year 1791. An efflorefcence of a palifh red colour foon appeared about the parts where the matter was inferted, and fpread itself rather extenfively, but died away in a few days without producing any variolous fymptoms. It is remarkable that variolous matter, when the fyftem is difpofed to reject it, fhould excite inflammation on the parts to which it is applied more fpeedily than when it produces the Small Pox. Indeed, it becomes almost a criterion by which we can determine whether the infection will be received or not. It seems as if a change, which endures through life, had been produced in the action, or disposition to action, in the vessels of the skin, and it is remarkable too, that whether this change has been effected by the small pox or the cow pox, that the disposition to sudden cuticular inflammation is the same on the application of variolous matter. She has since been repeatedly employed as a nurse to small pox patients, without experiencing any ill confequences. This woman had the Cow Pox when she lived in the service of a farmer in this parifh 31 years before. Case 5. Mrs. H., a respectable gentlewoman of this town, had the Cow Pox when very young. She received the infection in a manner that is not common. It was given by means of her handling some of the fame utensils which were in ufe among the fervants of her family who had the difeafe from milking infected cows. When the Cow Pox has prevailed in the dairy, it has often been communicated to thofe who have not milked the cows by the handle of the milk pail. Her hands had many of the Cow Pox fores upon them, and they were communicated to her nofe, which became inflamed and very much fwollen. Soon after this event, Mrs. H. was expofed to the contagion of the Small Pox, where it was scarcely poffible for her to have escaped had fhe been fufceptible of it, as fhe regularly attended a relative who had the difeafe in fo violent a degree that it proved fatal to him. In the year 1778 the Small Pox prevailed very much at Berkeley, and Mrs. H. not feeling perfectly fatisfied refpedting her fafety, no indifpofition having followed her expofure to the Small Pox, I inoculated her with active variolous matter. The fame appearance followed as in the preceding cafes, an efflorefcence on the arm without any effect on the conftitution. Case 6. It is a fadt fo well known among our dairy farmers, that thofe who have had the Small Pox either efcape the Cow Pox, or are difpofed to have it flightly, that as foon as the complaint fhews itself among the cattle, affiftants are procured, if poffible, who are thus rendered lefs fufceptible of it, otherwife the bufinefs of the farm could fcarcely go forward. In the month of May 1796 the Cow Pox broke out at Mr. Baker's, a farmer who lives near this place. The difeafe was communicated by means of a cow which was purchased in an infected ftate at a neighbouring fair, and not one of the farmer's cows, confifting of 30, which were at that time milked efcaping the contagion. The family confifted of a man fervant, 2 dairy maids, and a fervant boy, who, with the farmer himfelf, were twice a day employed in milking the cattle. The whole of this family, except Sarah Wynne, one of the dairy maids, had gone through the Small Pox. The confequence was, that the farmer and the fervant boy efcaped the infection of the Cow Pox entirely, and the fervant man and one of the maid fervants had each of them nothing more than a fore on one of their fingers, which produced no diforder in the fyftem. But the other dairy maid, Sarah Wynne, who never had the Small Pox, did not efcape in fo eafy a manner. She caught the complaint from the cows, and was affedted with the fymptoms defcribed in the 5th page in fo violent a degree, that fhe was confined to her bed, and rendered incapable for feveral days of purfuing her ordinary vocations in the farm. March 28th, 1797, I inoculated this girl, and carefully rubbed the variolous matter into 2 flight incifions made upon the left arm. A little inflammation appeared in the ufual manner around the parts where the matter was inferted, but fo early as the 5th day it vanifhed entirely without producing any effect on the fyftem. Case 7. Although the preceding hiftory pretty clearly evinces that the conftitution is far lefs fufceptible of the contagion of the Cow Pox after it has felt that of the Small Pox, and although in general, as I have obferved, they who have had the Small Pox, and are employed in milking cows which are infected with the cow pox, either escape the disorder or have fores on the hands without feeling any general indifpofition, yet the animal economy is fubjedt to fome variation in this refpect, which the following relation will point out. In the fummer of the year 1796 the Cow Pox appeared at the farm of Mr. Andrews, a considerable dairy adjoining to the town of Berkeley. It was communicated, as in the preceding inftance, by an infected cow purchased at a fair in the neighbourhood. The family confifted of the farmer, his wife, 2 fons, a man and a maid fervant, all of whom, except the farmer, who was fearful of the confequences, bore a part in milking the cows. The whole of them, exclufive of the man fervant, had regularly gone through the Small Pox, but in this cafe no one who milked the cows escaped the contagion. All of them had fores upon their hands, and fome degree of general indifpofition, preceded by pains and tumours in the axillae. But there was no comparifon in the feverity of the difeafe as it was felt by the fervant man who had escaped the Small Pox, and by thofe of the family who had not, for, while he was confined to his bed, they were able, without much inconvenience, to follow their ordinary bufinefs. February the 13th, 1797, I availed myself of an opportunity of inoculating William Rodway, the fervant man above alluded to. Variolous matter was inferted into both his arms, in the right by means of fuperficial incifions, and into the left by flight punctures into the cutis. Both were perceptibly inflamed on the 3rd day. After this, the inflammation about the punctures foon died away, but a fmall appearance of eryfipelas was manifeft about the edges of the incifions till the 8th day, when a little uneafinefs was felt for the fpace of half an hour in the right axilla. The inflammation then haftily difappeared without producing the moft diftant mark of affedtion of the fyftem. Case 8. Elizabeth Wynne, aged 57, lived as a fervant with a neighbouring farmer 38 years ago. She was then a dairy maid, and the Cow Pox broke out among the cows. She caught the difeafe with the reft of the family, but compared with them had it in a very flight degree, one very fmall fore only breaking out on the little finger of her left hand, and fcarcely any perceptible indifpofition following it. As the malady had shewn itself in fo flight a manner, and as it had taken place at fo diftant a period of her life, I was happy with the opportunity of trying the effects of variolous matter upon her conftitution, and on the 28th of March, 1797, I inoculated her by making 2 fuperficial incifions on the left arm, on which the matter was cautiously rubbed. A little efflorefcence foon appeared, and a tingling fensation was felt about the parts where the matter was inferted until the 3rd day, when both began to fubfide, and fo early as the 5th day it was evident that no indifpofition would follow. Case 9. Although the Cow Pox fhields the conftitution from the Small Pox, and the Small Pox provides a protection against its own future poifon, yet it appears that the human body is again and again fufceptible of the infectious matter of the Cow Pox, as the following hiftory will demonftrate. William Smith, of Purton, in this parifh, contracted this difeafe when he lived with a neighbouring farmer in the year 1780. One of the horfes belonging to the farm had fore heels, and it fell to his lot to attend him. By thefe means the infection was carried to the cows, and from the cows it was communicated to Smith. On one of his hands were feveral ulcerated fores, and he was affedted with fuch fymptoms as have been before defcribed. In the year 1791 the Cow Pox broke out at another farm where he then lived as a fervant, and he became affedted with it a fecond time, and in the year 1794 he was fo unfortunate as to catch it again. The difeafe was equally as fevere the fecond and 3rd time as it was on the firft. This is not the cafe in general. A fecond attack is commonly very flight, and fo, I am informed, it is among the cows. The reader will find further obfervations on this fubjedt in the fequel. These repeated indispositions must have arisen from the local irritation and not from the specific action of the vaccine virus. In the spring of the year 1795 he was twice inoculated, but no affection of the system could be produced from the variolous matter, and he is since associated with those who had the small pox in its most contagious state without feeling any effect from it. Case 10. Simon Nichols lived as a servant with Mr. Bromedge, a gentleman who resides on his own farm in this parish, in the year 1782. He was employed in applying dressings to the sore heels of one of his master's horses, and at the same time assisted in milking the cows. The cows became affected in consequence, but the difeafe did not shew itself on their nipples till several weeks after he had begun to drefs the horfe. He quitted Mr. Bromedge's fervice, and went to another farm without any fores upon him, but here his hands soon began to be affected in the common way, and he was much indifpofed with the ufual fymptoms. Concealing the nature of the malady from Mr. Cole, his new mafter, and being there alfo employed in milking, the Cow Pox was communicated to the cows. Soon afterwards Nichols was employed in a farm where the Small Pox broke out, when I inoculated him with feveral other patients, with whom he continued during the whole time of their confinement. His arm inflamed, but neither the inflammation nor his affociating with the inoculated family produced the leaft effect upon his constitution. Case 11. William Stinchcombe was a fellow fervant with Nichols at Mr. Bromedge's farm, at the time the cattle had the Cow Pox, and he was unfortunately infected by them. His left hand was very feverely affected with feveral corroding ulcers, and a tumour of considerable fize appeared in the axilla of that fide. His right hand had only one fmall fore upon it, and no tumour difcovered itfelf in the correfponding axilla. In the year 1792 Stinchcombe was inoculated with variolous matter, but no confequences enfued beyond a little inflammation in the arm for a few days. A large party were inoculated at the fame time, fome of whom had the difeafe in a more violent degree than is commonly feen from inoculation. He purpofely affociated with them, but could not receive the Small Pox. During the fickening of fome of his companions, their fymptoms fo ftrongly recalled to his mind his own ftate when fickened with the Cow Pox, that he very pertinently remarked their ftriking fimilarity. Case 12. The paupers of the village of Tortworth in this county were inoculated by Mr. Henry Jenner, furgeon of Berkeley, in the year 1795. Among them 8 patients prefented themfelves who had at different periods of their lives had the Cow Pox. One of them, Hester Walkley, I attended with that difeafe when fhe lived in the fervice of a farmer in the fame village in the year 1782, but neither this woman nor any other of the patients who had gone through the Cow Pox received the variolous infection either from the arm or from mixing in the society of the other patients who were inoculated at the fame time. This ftate of fecurity proved a fortunate circumftance, as many of the poor women were at the fame time in a ftate of pregnancy. Case 13. One inftance has occurred to me of the fyftem being affected from the matter iffuing from the heels of horfes, and of its remaining afterwards unfufceptible of the variolous contagion; another where the Small Pox appeared obfcurely; and a third in which its complete existence was positively ascertained. Firft, Thomas Pearce is the fon of a fmith and farrier near to this place. He never had the Cow Pox, but, in confequence of dreffing horfes with fore heels at his father's, when a lad he had fores on his fingers which suppurated, and which occafioned a pretty fevere indifpofition. 6 years afterwards I inferted variolous matter into his arm repeatedly, without being able to produce anything more than a flight inflammation, which appeared very foon after the matter was applied, and afterwards I expofed him to the contagion of the Small Pox with as little effect. It is a remarkable fact, and well known to many, that we are frequently foiled in our endeavours to communicate the small pox by inoculation to blacksmiths, who in the country are farriers. They often, as in the above instance, either resist the contagion entirely, or have the disease anomalously. Shall we not be able now to account for this on a rational principle? Case 14. Secondly, Mr. James Cole, a farmer in this parish, had a disease from the same source as related in the preceding case, and some years after was inoculated with variolous matter. He had a little pain in the axilla, and felt a slight indisposition for 3 or 4 hours. A few eruptions shewed themselves on the forehead, but they very soon disappeared without advancing to maturation. Case 15. Although in the 2 former instances the system seemed to be secured, or nearly so, from variolous infection, by the absorption of matter from sores produced by the diseased heels of horses, yet the following case renders it probable that this cannot be entirely relied upon until a disease has been generated by the morbid matter from the horse on the nipple of the cow, and passed through that medium to the human subject. The succeeding part will give further explanation of this subject. Mr. Abraham Riddiford, a farmer at Stone in this parish, in consequence of dressing a mare that had sore heels, was affected with very painful sores in both his hands, tumours in each axilla, and severe and general indisposition. A surgeon in the neighbourhood attended him, who, knowing the similarity between the appearance of the sores upon his hands and those produced by the cow pox, and being acquainted also with the effects of that disease on the human constitution, assured him that he never need to fear the infection of the small pox. But this assertion proved fallacious, for, on being exposed to the infection upwards of 20 years afterwards, he caught the disease, which took its regular course in a very mild way. There certainly was a difference perceptible, although it is not easy to describe it, in the general appearance of the puftules from that which we commonly see. Other practitioners who visited the patient at my request agreed with me in this point, though there was no room left for suspicion as to the reality of the disease, as I inoculated some of his family from the puftules, who had the small pox, with the usual appearances in consequence. Case 16. Sarah Nelmes, a dairymaid at a farmer's near this place, was infected with the cow pox from her master's cows in May 1796. She received the infection on a part of the hand which had been previously in a slight degree injured by a scratch from a thorn. A large pustulous sore and the usual symptoms accompanying the disease were produced in consequence. The pustule was so expressive of the true character of the cow pox, as it commonly appears upon the hand, that I have given a representation of it in the annexed plate. The 2 small puftules on the wrist arose also from the application of the virus to some minute abrasions of the cuticle, but the livid tint, if they ever had any, was not conspicuous at the time I saw the patient. The pustule on the forefinger shows the disease in an earlier stage. It did not actually appear on the hand of this young woman, but was taken from that of another, and is annexed for the purpose of representing the malady after it has newly appeared. Case 17. The more accurately to observe the progress of the infection, I selected a healthy boy, about 8 years old, for the purpose of inoculation for the cow pox. The matter was taken from a sore on the hand of a dairymaid. From the sore on the hand of Sarah Nelmes. See the preceding case and the plate. Who was infected by her master's cows, and it was inserted on the 14th of May 1796 into the arm of the boy by means of 2 superficial incisions, barely penetrating the cutis, each about half an inch along. On the 7th day he complained of uneasiness in the axilla, and on the 9th he became a little chilly, lost his appetite, and had a slight headache. During the whole of this day he was perceptibly indisposed, and spent the night with some degree of restlessness, but on the day following he was perfectly well. The appearance of the incisions in their progress to a state of maturation were much the fame as when produced in a fimilar manner by variolous matter. This appearance was in great meafure new to me, and I ever fhall recollect the pleafing fenfations it excited, as from its fimilarity to the puftule produced by variolous inoculation, it incontestably pointed out the clofe connection between the two difeafes, and almost anticipated the refult of my future experiments. The only difference which I perceived was, in the ftate of the limpid fluid arifing from the adtion of the virus, which affumed rather a darker hue, and in that of the efflorefcence fpreading round the incifions, which had more of an eryfipelatous look than we commonly perceive when variolous matter has been made ufe of in the fame manner, but the whole died away, leaving on the inoculated parts fcabs and subfequent efcars, without giving me or my patient the leaft trouble. In order to ascertain whether the boy, after feeling fo flight an affedtion of the fyftem from the Cow pox virus, was fecure from the contagion of the Small Pox, he was inoculated the 1st of July following with variolous matter, immediately taken from a puftule. Several flight punctures and incifions were made on both his arms, and the matter was carefully inferted, but no difeafe followed. The fame appearances were obfervable on the arms as we commonly fee when a patient has had variolous matter applied, after having either the Cow Pox or the Small Pox. Several months afterwards he was again inoculated with variolous matter, but no fenfible effect was produced on the conftitution. Here my refearches were interrupted till the fpring of the year 1798, when, from the wetnefs of the early part of the feafon, many of the farmers' horfes in this neighbourhood were affedted with fore heels, in confequence of which the Cow Pox broke out among feveral of our dairies, which afforded me an opportunity of making further obfervations upon this curious difeafe. A mare, in the property of a perfon who keeps a dairy in a neighbouring parifh, began to have fore heels the latter end of the month of February 1798, which were occafionally wafhed by the fervant men of the farm. Thomas Virgo, William Werret, and William Haynes, who in confequence became affedted with fores in their hands, followed by inflamed lymphatic glands in the arms and axillae, fhivering fucceeded by heat, laffitude, and general pains in the limbs. A fingle paroxysm terminated the difeafe, for within 24 hours they were free from general indifpofition, nothing remaining but the fores on their hands. Haynes and Virgo, who had gone through the Small Pox from inoculation, described their feelings as very fimilar to thofe which affedted them on fickening with that malady. Werret never had had the Small Pox. Haynes was daily employed as one of the milkers at the farm, and the difeafe began to shew itself among the cows about 10 days after he firft affifted in washing the mares' heels. Their nipples became fore in the ufual way, with bluifh puftules, but as remedies were early applied they did not ulcerate to any extent. Case 18. John Baker, a child of 5 years old, was inoculated March 16th, 1798, with matter taken from the puftule on the hand of Thomas Virgo, one of the fervants who had been infedted from the mares' heels. He became ill on the 6th day, with fymptoms fimilar to thofe excited by Cow Pox matter. On the 8th day he was free from indifpofition. There was fome variation in the appearance of the puftule on the arm. Although it somewhat refembled a Small Pox puftule, yet its similitude was not fo confpicuous as when excited by matter from the nipple of the cow, or when the matter has pafled from thence through the medium of the human subject. See Plate No. 2. This experiment was made to ascertain the progrefs and subfequent effedts of the difeafe when thus propagated. We have feen that the virus from the horfe, when it proves infectious to the human subject, is not to be relied upon as rendering the fyftem fecure from variolous infection, but that the matter produced by it on the nipple of the cow is perfectly fo. Whether its paffing from the horfe through the human conftitution, as in the prefent inftance, will produce a fimilar effect, remains to be decided. This would now have to be effected, but the boy was rendered unfit for inoculation from having felt the effects of a contagious fever in a workhouse soon after this experiment was made. Case 19. William Summers, a child of 5 years and a half old, was inoculated the same day with Baker, with matter taken from the nipples of one of the infected cows at the farm alluded to in page 32. He became indisposed on the 6th day, vomited once, and felt the usual slight symptoms till the 8th day, when he appeared perfectly well. The progress of the pustule, formed by the infection of the virus, was similar to that noticed in case 17, with this exception, its being free from the livid tint observed in that instance. Case 20. From William Summers the difeafe was transferred to William Pead, a boy of 8 years old, who was inoculated March 28th. On the 6th day he complained of pain in the axilla, and on the 7th was affedted with the common symptoms of a patient sickening with the Small Pox from inoculation, which did not terminate till the 3rd day after the feizure. So perfect was the similarity to the variolous fever, that I was induced to examine the skin, conceiving there might have been fome eruptions, but none appeared. The efflorefcent blufh around the part punctured in the boy's arm was fo truly characteriftic of that which appears on variolous inoculation, that I have given a reprefentation of it. The drawing was made when the puftule was beginning to die away, and the areola retiring from the centre. See plate No. 3. Case 21. April 5th. Several children and adults were inoculated from the arm of William Pead. The greater part of them fickened on the 6th day, and were well on the 7th, but in 3 of the number a fecondary indifpofition arofe in confequence of an extenfive eryfipelatous inflammation which appeared on the inoculated arms. It feemed to arife from the ftate of the puftule, which spread out, accompanied with fome degree of pain, to about half the diameter of a fixpence. One of thefe patients was an infant of half a year old. By the application of mercurial ointment to the inflamed parts, a treatment recommended under fimilar circumftances in the inoculated Small Pox, the complaint fubfided without giving much trouble. Hannah Excell, a healthy girl of 7 years old, and one of the patients above mentioned, received the infection from the infertion of the virus under the cuticle of the arm in 3 diftinct points. This was not done intentionally, but from the accidental touch of the point of the lancet, 1 puncture being always fufficient. The puftules which arofe in confequence fo much refembled, on the 9th day, thofe appearing from the infertion of variolous matter, that an experienced inoculator would fcarcely have difcovered a shade of difference at that period. Experience now tells me that almoft the only variation which follows confifts in the puftulous fluids remaining limpid nearly to the time of its total difappearance, and not, as in the direct Small Pox, becoming purulent. See plate No. 4. Case 22. From the arm of this girl matter was taken and inferted April 12th into the arms of John Marklove, 1 year and a half old, Robert F. Jenner, 11 months old, Mary Pead, 5 years old, and Mary James, 6 years old. Among thefe, Robert F. Jenner did not receive the infection. The arms of the other 3 inflamed properly, and began to affedt the fyftem in the ufual manner; but being under fome apprehensions from the preceding cafes that a troublesome eryfipelas might arife, I determined on making an experiment with the view of cutting off its fource. Accordingly, on the 8th day after the patients had felt an indifpofition that was juft perceptible, of about 12 hours, I applied in 2 of thefe cafes out of the 3, on the veficle formed by the virus, a little mild cauftic, compofed of equal parts of quicklime and foap, and fuffered it to remain on the part 6 hours. Perhaps a few touches with the lapis septicus would have proved equally efficacious. It seemed to give the children but little uneasiness, and effectually answered my intention in preventing the appearance of erysipelas. Indeed it seemed to do more, for in half an hour after its application the indifpofition of the children ceafed. What effect would a fimilar treatment produce in inoculation for the Small Pox? Thefe precautions were perhaps unneceffary, as the arm of a third child, Mary Pead, which was suffered to take its common courfe, fcabbed quickly, without any eryfipelas. The subfequent part of this Treatife will fufficiently shew the proper practice in cafes of inflammation of the inoculated arm. Case 23. From this child's arm matter was taken and transferred to that of J. Barge, a boy of 7 years old. He fickened on the 8th day, went through the difeafe with the ufual flight fymptoms, and without any inflammation on the arm beyond the common efflorefcence furrounding the puftule, an appearance fo often feen in inoculated Small Pox. After the many fruitless attempts to give the Small Pox to thofe who had had the Cow Pox, it did not appear neceffary, nor was it convenient to me, to inoculate the whole of thofe who had been the fubjedts of thefe late trials, yet I thought it right to fee the effects of variolous matter on fome of them, particularly William Summers, the firft of thefe patients, who had been infedted with matter taken from the cow. He was therefore inoculated with variolous matter from a frefh puftule, but, as in the preceding cafes, the fyftem did not feel the effects of it in the fmalleft degree. I had an opportunity alfo of having this boy, Barge, and William Pead inoculated by my nephew, Mr. Henry Jenner, whofe report to me is as follows: I have inoculated Pead and Barge, two of the boys whom you lately infedted with the Cow Pox. On the fecond day the incifions were inflamed, and there was a pale inflammatory ftain around them. On the third day thefe appearances were ftill increafing, and their arms itched considerably. On the fourth day the inflammation was evidently fubfiding, and on the fixth it was scarcely perceptible. No fymptom of indifpofition followed. To convince myself that the variolous matter made ufe of was in a perfect ftate, I at the fame time inoculated a patient with fome of it who had never gone through the Cow Pox, and it produced the Small Pox in the ufual regular manner." Thefe experiments afforded me much fatisfadion. They proved that the matter in paffing from one human fubjedt to another through 5 gradations, loft none of its original properties, J. Barge being the 5th who received the infection fucceffively from William Summers, the boy to whom it was communicated from the cow. I fhall now conclude this Inquiry with fome general obfervations on the subject, and on fome others which are interwoven with it. Although I prefume it may be unneceffary to produce further teftimony in fupport of my affertion "that the Cow Pox protects the human conftitution from the infection of the Small Pox," yet it affords me considerable fatisfadion to fay, that Lord Somerville, the Prefident of the Board of Agriculture, to whom this paper was shewn by Sir Joseph Banks, has found upon inquiry that the ftatements were confirmed by the concurring teftimony of Mr. Dollon, a furgeon who refides in a dairy country remote from this, in which thefe obfervations were made. With refpect to the opinion adduced, "that the fource of the infection is a peculiar morbid matter arifing in the horfe," although I have not been able to prove it from actual experiments conducted immediately under my own eye, yet the evidence I have adduced appears fufficient to eftablifh it. They who are not in the habit of conducting experiments may not be aware of the coincidence of circumftances neceffary for their being managed fo as to prove perfectly decifive, nor how often men engaged in profefsional purfuits are liable to interruptions which difappoint them almost at the inftant of their being accomplifhed. However, I feel no room for hefitation refpedting the common origin of the difeafe, being well convinced that it never appears among the cows, except it can be traced to a cow introduced among a general herd which has been previously infedted, or to an infedted fervant. unless they have been milked by someone who, at the same time, has the care of a horse affected with difeased heels. The spring of the year 1797, which I intended particularly to have devoted to the completion of this inveftigation, proved, from its drynefs, remarkably adverfe to my wifhes, for it frequently happens, while the farmers' horfes are expofed to the cold rains which fall at that feafon, that their heels become difeased, and no Cow Pox then appears in the neighbourhood. The active quality of the virus from the horse's heels is greatly increafed after it has acted on the nipples of the cow, as it rarely happens that the horfe affedts his drefler with fores, and as rarely that a milkmaid efcapes the infection when fhe milks infedted cows. It is moft active at the commencement of the difeafe, even before it has acquired a pus-like appearance. Indeed, I am not confident whether this property in the matter does not entirely ceafe as foon as it is secreted in the form of pus. I am induced to think it does ceafe, and that it is the thin darkifh looking fluid only, oozing from the newly formed cracks in the heels, fimilar to what fometimes appears from the eryfipelatous blifters, which gives the difeafe. It is very eafy to procure pus from old fores on the heels of horfes. This I have often inferted into fcratches made with a lancet on the found nipples of cows, and have feen no other effects from it than fimple inflammation. Nor am I certain that the nipples of the cows are at all times in a ftate to receive the infection. The appearance of the difeafe in the fpring and the early part of the fummer, when they are difpofed to be affedted with fpontaneous eruptions fo much more frequently than at other feafons, induces me to think that the virus from the horfe muft be received upon them when they are in this ftate, in order to produce effedts. Experiments, however, muft determine thefe points. But it is clear that when the Cow Pox virus is once generated, that the cows cannot refift the contagion, in whatever ftate their nipples may chance to be, if they are milked with an infedted hand. Whether the matter, either from the cow or the horfe, will affect the found fkin of the human body, I cannot pofitively determine. Probably it will not, unlefs on thofe parts where the cuticle is extremely thin, as on the lips for example. I have known an inftance of a poor girl who produced an ulceration on her lip by frequently holding her finger to her mouth to cool the raging of a Cow Pox fore by blowing upon it. The hands of the farmers' fervants here, from the nature of their employment, are conftantly expofed to thofe injuries which occafion abrafions to the cuticle, to punctures from thorns and fuch like accidents, fo that they are always in a ftate to feel the confequences of expofure to infectious matter. It is fingular to obferve that the Cow Pox virus, although it renders the conftitution unfufceptible of the variolous, should, neverthelefs, leave it unchanged with refpect to its own action. I have already produced an inftance to point this out, (See Case 9), and fhall now corroborate it with another. Elizabeth Wynne, who had the Cow Pox, in the year 1759, was inoculated with variolous matter without effect, in the year 1797, and again caught the Cow Pox in the year 1798. When I faw her, which was on the 8th day after fhe received the infection, I found her affedted with general laffitude, shiverings, alternating with heat, coldnefs of the extremities, and a quick and irregular pulfe. Thefe symptoms were preceded by a pain in the axilla. On her hand was one large puftulous fore, which refembled that delineated in Plate No. 1. As I have before obferved, thefe symptoms probably arofe from the irritation of the fore, which was very painful. It is curious alfo to obferve, that the virus, which with refpect to its effects is undetermined and uncertain previous to its paffing from the horfe through the medium of the cow, (further obfervations will be adduced on this fubjedt), fhould then not only become more active, but should invariably and completely possess those specific properties which induce in the human constitution symptoms similar to those of the variolous fever, and effect in it that peculiar change which for ever renders it unsusceptible of the variolous contagion. May it not then be reasonably conjectured that the source of the Small Pox is morbid matter of a peculiar kind, generated by a difeafe in the horfe, and that accidental circumstances may have again and again arifen, ftill working new changes upon it, until it has acquired the contagious and malignant form under which we now commonly fee it making its devastations amongst us? And, from a consideration of the change which the infectious matter undergoes from producing a difeafe on the cow, may we not conceive that many contagious difeafes now prevalent amongst us may owe their present appearance not to a fimple but to a compound origin? For example, is it difficult to imagine that the meafles, the scarlet fever, and the ulcerous fore throat with a spotted skin have all fprung from the fame fource, assuming fome variety in their forms according to the nature of their new combinations? The fame question will apply respecting the origin of many other contagious difeafes which bear a ftrong analogy to each other. There are certainly more forms than one without considering the common variation between the confluent and diftindt, in which the Small Pox appears in what is called the natural way. About 7 years ago a fpecies of Small Pox fpread through many of the towns and villages of this part of Glouceftershire. It was of fo mild a nature that a fatal inftance was scarcely ever heard of, and confequently fo little dreaded by the lower orders of the community, that they scrupled not to hold the fame intercourfe with each other as if no infectious difeafe had been prefent among them. I never faw nor heard an inftance of its being confluent. The moft accurate manner, perhaps, in which I can convey an idea of it is, by faying, that had 50 individuals been taken promifcuoufly and infedted by expofure to this contagion, they would have had as mild and light a difeafe as if they had been inoculated with variolous matter in the ufual way. The harmlefs manner in which it fhewed itself could not arife from any peculiarity either in the feafon or the weather, for I watched its progrefs upwards of a year without perceiving any variation in its general appearance. I consider it then a variety of the Small Pox. My friend Dr. Hicks of Briftol, who during the prevalence of this diftemper was refident at Gloucefter, and physician to the hofpital there, where it was feen foon after its firft appearance in this country, had opportunities of making numerous obfervations upon it, which it is his intention to communicate to the public. In fome of the preceding Cafes I have noticed the attention that was paid to the ftate of the variolous matter previous to the experiment of inferting it into the arms of thofe who had gone through the Cow Pox. This I conceived to be of great importance in conducting thefe experiments, and were it always properly attended to by thofe who inoculate for the Small Pox, it might prevent much subfequent mischief and confufion. With the view of enforcing fo neceffary a precaution, I fhall take the liberty of digreifing fo far as to point out fome unpleafant facts, relative to mifmanagement in this particular, which have fallen under my own obfervation. A medical gentleman, now no more, who for many years inoculated in this neighbourhood, frequently preferved the variolous matter intended for his ufe on a piece of lint or cotton, which in its fluid ftate was put into a vial, corked, and conveyed into a warm pocket, a fituation certainly favourable for speedily producing putrefaction in it. In this ftate, not unfrequently after it had been taken feveral days from the puftules, it was inferted into the arms of his patients, and brought on inflammation of the incifed parts, fwellings of the axillary glands, fever, and fometimes eruptions. But what was this difeafe? Certainly not the Small Pox, for the matter having from putrefaction loft, or suffered a derangement in its fpecific properties, was no longer capable of producing that malady, thofe who had been inoculated in this manner being as much fubjedt to the contagion of the Small Pox as if they had never been under the influence of this artificial difeafe; and many unfortunately fell victims to it, who thought themfelves in perfect fecurity. The same unfortunate circumstance of giving a difeafe fuppofed to be the Small Pox with inefficacious variolous matter having occurred under the diredtion of fome other practitioners within my knowledge, and probably from the fame incautious method of fecuring the variolous matter, I avail myself of this opportunity of mentioning what I conceive to be of great importance; and, as a further cautionary hint, I fhall again digrefs fo far as to add another obfervation on the subject of inoculation. Whether it be yet ascertained by experiment that the quantity of variolous matter inferted into the fkin makes any difference with refpedt to the fubfequent mildnefs or violence of the difeafe, I know not; but I have the ftrongeft reafon for fuppofing that if either the punctures or incifions be made fo deep as to go through it, and wound the adipofe membrane, that the rifk of bringing on a violent difeafe is greatly increafed. I have known an inoculator, whofe practice was "to cut deep enough (to ufe his own expreffion) to fee a bit of fat," and there to lodge the matter. The great number of bad cafes, independent of inflammations and abfcefles on the arms, and the fatality which attended this practice was almost inconceivable, and I cannot account for it on any other principle than that of the matter being placed in this fituation inftead of the fkin. It was the practice of another, whom I well remember, to pinch up a fmall portion of the fkin on the arms of his patients, and to pafs through it a needle, with a thread attached to it previoufly dipped in variolous matter. The thread was lodged in the perforated parts, and confequently left in contadt with the cellular membrane. This practice was attended with the fame ill fuccefs as the former. Although it is very improbable that any one would now inoculate in this rude way by defign, yet thefe obfervations may tend to place a double guard over the lancet, when infants, whofe skins are comparatively fo very thin, fall under the care of the inoculator. A very refpedtable friend of mine, Dr. Hardwicke, of Sodbury in this county, inoculated great numbers of patients previous to the introduction of the more modern method by Sutton, and with fuch fuccefs that a fatal inftance occurred as rarely as fince that method has been adopted. It was the Doctor's practice to make as flight an incifion as poffible upon the fkin, and there to lodge a thread faturated with the variolous matter. When his patients became indifpofed, agreeably to the cuftom then prevailing, they were directed to go to bed, and were kept moderately warm. Is it not probable then, that the fuccefs of the modern practice may depend more upon the method of invariably depofiting the virus in or upon the fkin, than on the fubfequent treatment of the difeafe? I do not mean to infinuate that expofure to cool air and fuffering the patient to drink cold water when hot and thirfty may not moderate the eruptive fymptoms, and leffen the number of puftules. Yet, to repeat my former obfervation, I cannot account for the uninterrupted fuccefs, or nearly fo, of one practitioner, and the wretched ftate of the patients under the care of another, where, in both inftances, the general treatment did not differ effentially, without conceiving it to arife from the different modes of inferting the matter for the purpofe of producing the difeafe. As it is not the identical matter inferted which is abforbed into the conftitution, but that which is, by fome peculiar procefs in the animal economy, generated by it, is it not probable that different parts of the human body may prepare or modify the virus differently? Although the fkin, for example, adipofe membrane or mucose membranes, are all capable of producing the variolous virus by the ftimulus given by the particles originally depofited upon them, yet I am induced to conceive that each of thefe parts is capable of producing fome variation in the qualities of the matter previous to its affedting the conftitution. What elfe can conftitute the difference between the Small Pox when communicated cafually, or in what has been termed the natural way, or when brought on artificially through the medium of the fkin? After all, are the variolous particles, poffeffing their true fpecific and contagious principles, ever taken up and conveyed by the lymphatics unchanged into the blood veffels? I imagine not. Were this the cafe, should we not find the blood fufficiently loaded with them in some stages of the smallpox to communicate the disease by inserting it under the cuticle or by spreading it on the surface of an ulcer? Yet experiments have determined the impracticality of its being given in this way, although it has been proved that variolous matter, when much diluted with water and applied to the skin in the usual manner, will produce the disease. But it would be digressing beyond a proper boundary to go minutely into this subject here. At what period the cow pox was first noticed here is not upon record. Our oldest farmers were not unacquainted with it in their earliest days, when it appeared among their farms without any deviation from the phenomena which it now exhibits. Its connection with the smallpox seems to have been unknown to them. Probably the general introduction of inoculation first occasioned the discovery. Its rise in this country may not have been of very remote date, as the practice of milking cows might formerly have been in the hands of women only, which I believe is the case now in some other dairy countries, and consequently that the cows might not in former times have been exposed to the contagious matter brought by the men servants from the heels of horses. Indeed, a knowledge of the source of the infection is new in the minds of most of the farmers in this neighbourhood, but has at length produced good consequences, and it seems probable from the precautions they are now disposed to adopt, that the appearance of the cow pox here may be either entirely extinguished or become extremely rare. Should it be asked whether this investigation be a matter of mere curiosity, or whether it tends to any beneficial purpose, I should answer, that notwithstanding the happy effects of inoculation, with all the improvements which the practice has received since its first introduction into this country, it not very unfrequently produces deformity of the skin, and sometimes, under the best management, proves fatal. These circumstances must naturally create in every instance some degree of painful solicitude for its consequences. But as I have never known fatal effects arise from the cow pox, even when impressed in the most unfavourable manner, producing extensive inflammations and suppurations on the hands, and as it clearly appears that this disease leaves the constitution in a state of perfect security from the infection of the smallpox, may we not infer that a mode of inoculation may be introduced preferable to that at present adopted, especially among those families, which, from previous circumstances, we may judge to be predisposed to have the disease unfavourably? It is an excess in the number of pustules which we chiefly dread in the smallpox. But in the cow pox no pustules appear, nor does it seem possible for the contagious matter to produce the disease from effluvia, or by any other means than contact, and that probably not simply between the virus and the cuticle, so that a single individual in a family might at any time receive it without the risk of infecting the rest, or of spreading a distemper that fills a country with terror. Several instances have come under my observation, which justify the assertion that the disease cannot be propagated by effluvia. The first boy whom I inoculated with the matter of cow pox slept in a bed while the experiment was going forward with two children who never had gone through either that disease or the smallpox without infecting either of them. A young woman who had the cow pox to a great extent, several sores which maturated having appeared on the hands and wrists, slept in the same bed with a fellow dairymaid who never had been infected with either the cow pox or the smallpox, but no indisposition followed. Another instance has occurred of a young woman on whose hands were several large suppurations from the cow pox, who was at the same time a daily nurse to an infant, but the complaint was not communicated to the child. In some other points of view, the inoculation of this disease appears preferable to the variolous inoculation. In constitutions predisposed to scrofula, how frequently we see the inoculated smallpox rouse into activity that distressful malady. This circumstance does not seem to depend on the manner in which the distemper has shown itself, for it has as frequently happened among those who have had it mildly, as when it has appeared in the contrary way. There are many who from some peculiarity in the habit resist the common effects of variolous matter inserted into the skin, and who are in consequence haunted through life with the distressing idea of being insecure from subsequent infection. A ready mode of dissipating anxiety originating from such a cause must now appear obvious. And as we have seen that the constitution may at any time be made to feel the febrile attack of cow pox, might it not, in many chronic difeafes, be introduced into the fyftem with the probability of affording relief upon well known phyfiological principles? Inoculation in a common way upon the arm will feldom produce this effect. When the difeafe takes place among the dairy people, the virus comes in contact with pre exifting fores, which does not fail to produce an irritation that affects the fyftem generally. Although I say the fyftem may at any time be made to feel the febrile attack of Cow Pox, yet I have a fingle inftance before me where the virus acted locally only, but it is not in the leaft probable that the fame perfon would refift the adtion both of the Cow Pox virus and the variolous. Elizabeth Sarfnet lived as a dairymaid at New Park Farm, in this parifh. All the cows and the fervants employed in milking had the Cow Pox, but this woman, though fhe had feveral fores upon her fingers, felt no tumours in the axillae, nor any general indifpofition. On being afterwards cafually expofed to variolous infection, fhe had the Small Pox in a mild way. This will be more fatisfactorily explained in the fequel. Hannah Pick, another of the dairymaids, who was a fellow fervant with Elizabeth Sarfnet, when the diftemper broke out at the farm, was at the fame time infected, but this young woman had not only fores upon her hands, but felt herfelf alfo much indifpofed for a day or two. After this I made feveral attempts to give her the Small Pox by inoculation, but they all proved fruitlefs. From the former cafe then we fee that the animal economy is fubjedt to the fame laws in one difeafe as the other. The following cafe, which has very lately occurred, renders it highly probable that not only the heels of the horfe, but other parts of the body of that animal are capable of generating the virus which produces the Cow Pox. An extenfive inflammation of the eryfipelatous kind appeared without any apparent caufe upon the upper part of the thigh of a fucking colt, the property of Mr. Millet, a farmer at Rockhampton, a village near Berkeley. The inflammation continued feveral weeks, and at length terminated in the formation of 3 or 4 fmall abfcefles. The inflamed parts were fermented, and dreffings were applied by fome of the fame perfons who were employed in milking the cows. The number of cows milked was 24, and the whole of them had the Cow Pox. The milkers, confifting of the farmer's wife, a man and a maid fervant, were infected by the cows. The man fervant had previously gone through the Small Pox, and felt but little of the Cow Pox. The fervant maid had fome years before been infected with the Cow Pox, and fhe alfo felt it now in a flight degree. But the farmer's wife, who never had gone through either of thefe difeafes, felt its effects very feverely. That the difeafe produced upon the cows by the colt, and from thence conveyed to thofe who milked them, was the true and not the fpurious Cow Pox, there can be scarcely any room for fufpicion. Yet it would have been more completely fatisfactory, had the effects of variolous matter been ascertained on the farmer's wife, but there was a peculiarity in her fituation which prevented my making the experiment. Thus far I have proceeded in an inquiry, founded, as it muft appear, on the bafis of experiment, in which, however, conjedture has been occafionally admitted, in order to prefent to perfons well fituated for fuch difcuffions, objects for a more minute inveftigation. In the meantime I fhall myfelf continue to profecute this inquiry, encouraged by the pleafing hope of its becoming effentially beneficial to mankind. Section 2. Section 2 of an Inquiry into the Causes and Effects of the Variolae Vaccinae by Edward Jenner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jordan Watts, Oxfordshire. Publication 2. Further Observations on the Variolae Vaccinae. Part 1. Advertisement. The foregoing pages contain the whole of my first treatise on the Variolae Vaccinae, published in June 1798. The importance of the inquiry to the whole human race naturally excited universal attention. Ingenuity and industry were set in motion, but as physiological discussions are ever liable to error, from the complicated nature of their character, I soon clearly perceived that this theory, so beneficial to mankind, was liable to fall into disrepute, and to be wholly discredited by the force of hasty conclusions unfounded on experiment. To guard the public mind from prejudice, and to enforce the necessity of a scrupulous precaution in the conduct of inoculation with vaccine matter, I was induced to offer the world further observations on the disease, which were published in the beginning of the year 1799. These treatises I have here combined, together with some additions, which the continuance of the inquiry has enabled me to submit to the public. Further Observations, etc., etc. Although it has not been in my power to extend the inquiry into the causes and effects of the Variolae Vaccinae much beyond its original limits, yet, perceiving that it is beginning to excite a general spirit of investigation, I think it of importance, without delay, to communicate such facts as have since occurred, and to point out the fallacious sources from whence a disease resembling the true Variolae Vaccinae might arise, with the view of preventing those who may inoculate from producing a spurious disease, and further to enforce the precaution suggested in the former treatise on the subject, of subduing the inoculated pustule as soon as it has sufficiently produced its influence on the constitution. From a want of due discrimination of the real existence of the disease either in the brute or in the human subject, and also of that stage of it in which it is capable of producing the change in the animal economy which renders it unsusceptible of the contagion of the smallpox, unpleasant consequences might ensue, the source of which, perhaps, might not be suspected by one inexperienced in conducting such experiments. My late publication contains a relation of most of the facts which had come under my own inspection at the time it was written, interspersed with some conjectural observations. Since then, Dr. G. Pearson has established an inquiry into the validity of my principal assertion, the result of which cannot but be highly flattering to my feelings. It contains not a single case which I think can be called an exception to the fact I was so firmly impressed with, that the cow pox protects the human body from the small pox. I have myself received some further confirmations, which shall be subjoined. I have lately also been favoured with a letter from a gentleman of great respectability, Dr. Ingenhouse, informing me that, on making an inquiry into the subject in the county of Wiltshire, he discovered that a farmer near Caen had been infected with the small pox after having had the cow pox, and that the disease in each instance was so strongly characterised as to render the facts incontrovertible. The cow pox, it seems, from the doctor's information, was communicated to the farmer from his cows at the time that they gave out an offensive stench from their udders. Some other instances have likewise been represented to me of the appearance of the disease, apparently marked with its characteristic symptoms, and yet that the patients have afterwards had the small pox. On these cases I shall, for the present, suspend any particular remarks, but I hope that the general observations I have to offer in the sequel will prove of sufficient weight to render the idea of their ever having had existence, but as cases of spurious cow pox, extremely doubtful. Ere I proceed, let me be permitted to observe that truth in this and every other physiological inquiry that has occupied my attention, has ever been the object of my pursuit, and should it appear in the present instance that I have been led into error, fond as I may appear of the offspring of my labours, I had rather see it perifh at once, than exist and do a public injury. I shall proceed to enumerate the fources, or what appear to me as fuch, of a spurious Cow Pox. Firft, that arifing from puftules on the nipples or udder of the cow, which puftules contain no fpecific virus. Second, from matter, although originally poffeffing the fpecific virus, which has suffered a decompofition, either from putrefaction or from any other caufe lefs obvious to the fenfes. Thirdly, from matter taken from an ulcer in an advanced ftage, which ulcer arofe from a true Cow Pock. Fourthly, from matter produced on the human skin from contact with fome peculiar morbid matter generated by a horfe. On thefe subjects I shall offer fome comments. Firft, to what length puftulous difeafes of the udder and nipples of the cow may extend, it is not in my power to determine, but certain it is that thefe parts of the animal are fubject to fome variety of maladies of this nature, and as many of thefe eruptions, probably all of them, are capable of giving a difeafe to the human body, would it not be difcreet for thofe engaged in this inveftigation to fufpend controverfy, and cavil until they can ascertain with precifion what is and what is not the genuine Cow Pox? For example, a farmer who is not converfant with any of thefe maladies, but who may have heard of the Cow Pox in general terms, may acquaint a neighbouring furgeon that the diftemper appears at his farm. The furgeon, eager to make an experiment, takes away matter, inoculates, produces a fore, uneafinefs in the axilla, and perhaps fome affedtion of the fyftem. This is a way in which a fallacious idea of security both in the mind of the inoculator and the patient may arife. For a difeafe may thus have been propagated from a fimple eruption only. One of the firft objects then of this purfuit, as I have obferved, should be, to learn how to diftinguifh with accuracy between that peculiar puftule which is the true Cow Pock, and that which is fpurious. Until experience has determined this, we view our object through a mift. Let us for inftance fuppofe that the Small Pox and the Chicken Pox were at the fame time to spread among the inhabitants of a country which had never been vifited by either of thefe distempers, and where they were quite unknown before, what confufion would arife! The refemblance between the fymptoms of the eruptive fever and between the puftules in either cafe would be fo ftriking, that a patient who had gone through the Chicken Pox to any extent, would feel equally eafy with regard to his future fecurity from the Small Pox, as the perfon who had actually pafled through that difeafe. Time and future obfervation would draw the line of diftinction. So I prefume it will be with the Cow Pox, until it is more generally understood. All cavilling therefore on the mere report of thofe who tell us they have had this diftemper, and are afterwards found to be fufceptible of the Small Pox, should be fufpended. To illuftrate this, I beg leave to give the following hiftory. Sarah Merlin, of the parifh of Eastington in this county, when about 13 or 14 years of age, lived as a fervant with Farmer Clarke, who kept a dairy confifting of about 18 cows at Stonehoufe, a neighbouring village. The nipples and udders of 3 of the cows were extenfively affedted with large white blifters. Thefe cows the girl milked daily, and at the fame time fhe affifted, with 2 others, in milking the reft of the herd. It foon appeared that the difeafe was communicated to the girl. The reft of the cows escaped the infection, although they were milked feveral days after the 3 above fpecified had thefe eruptions on the nipples and udders, and even after the girl's hand became fore. The 2 others who were engaged in milking, although they milked the cows indifcriminately, received no injury. On the fingers of each of the girl's hands there appeared several large white blisters, she supposes about 3 or 4 on each finger. The hands and arms inflamed and swelled, but no constitutional indisposition followed. The sores were anointed with some domestic ointment and got well without ulcerating. As this malady was called the Cow Pox, and recorded as such in the mind of the patient, she became regardless of the Small Pox, but on being exposed to it some years afterwards, she was infected, and had a full burthen. Now had any one conversant with the habits of the difeafe heard this history, they would have had no hesitation in pronouncing it a cafe of spurious Cow Pox, considering its deviation in the numerous blifters which appeared on the girl's hands, their termination without ulceration, its not proving more generally contagious at the farm, either among the cattle or thofe employed in milking, and considering alfo that the patient felt no general indifpofition, although there was fo great a number of vesicles. This is perhaps the moft deceptious form in which an eruptive difeafe can be communicated from the cow, and it certainly requires fome attention in discriminating it. The moft perfect criterion by which the judgment may be guided, is perhaps that adopted by thofe who attend infected cattle. Thefe white blifters on the nipples, they fay, never eat into the flefhy parts, like thofe which are commonly of a bluifh caft, and which constitute the true Cow Pox, but that they affect the skin only, quickly end in scabs, and are not nearly fo infectious. That which appeared to me as one caufe of spurious eruptions, I have already remarked in the former treatife, namely, the tranfition that the cow makes in the fpring from a poor to a nutritious diet, and from the udders becoming at this time more vafcular than ufual for the fupply of milk. But there is another fource of inflammation and puftules, which I believe is not uncommon in all the dairy counties in the weft of England. A cow intended to be expofed for fale, having naturally a fmall udder, is previously for a day or two neither milked artificially, nor is her calf suffered to have accefs to her. Thus the milk is preternaturally accumulated, and the udder and nipples become greatly diftended. The confequences frequently are, inflammation and eruptions, which maturate. Whether a difeafe generated in this way has the power of affecting the conftitution in any peculiar manner, I cannot prefume pofitively to determine. It has been conjectured to have been a caufe of the true Cow Pox, though my inquiries have not led me to adopt this fuppofition in any one inftance. On the contrary, I have known the milkers affected by it, but always found that an affedtion thus induced left the fyftem as fufceptible of the Small Pox as before. What is advanced in my fecond pofition I confider alfo of very great importance, and I could wifh to be ftrongly impreffed on the minds of all who may be difpofed to conclude haftily on my obfervations, whether engaged in their inveftigation by experiments or not. To place this in its cleareft point of view, as the fimilarity between the action of the Small Pox and the Cow Pox matter is fo obvious, it will be neceffary to confider what we fometimes obferve to take place in inoculation for the Small Pox when imperfect variolous matter is made ufe of. The concife history on this subject that was brought forward refpedting what I had obferved in this neighbourhood, I perceive by a reference fince made to the Memoirs of the Medical Society of London, may be considered as no more than a corroboration of the facts very clearly detailed by Mr. Kite. See an account of fome anomalous appearances confequent to the inoculation of the Small Pox, by Charles Kite, Surgeon, of Gravesend, in the Memoirs of the Medical Society of London, Vol. 4, p. 114. To this copious evidence I have to add ftill more in the following communications from Mr. Earle, Surgeon, of Frampton upon Severn, in this county, which I deem the more valuable, as he has with much candour permitted me to make them public. Sir, I have read with satisfaction your late publication on the Variolae Vaccinae, and being, among many other curious circumstances, particularly struck with that relating to the inefficiency of Small Pox matter in a particular ftate, I think it proper to lay before you the following facts which came with my own knowledge, and which certainly tend to strengthen the opinions advanced in pages 51 and 52 of your Treatife. In March, 1784, a general inoculation took place at Arlingham in this county. I inoculated several patients with active variolous matter, all of whom had the difeafe in a favourable way, but my matter being all ufed, and not being able to procure any more in the ftate I wifhed, I was under the neceffity of taking it from a puftule which, experience has fince proved, was advanced too far to anfwer the purpofe I intended. Of 5 perfons inoculated with this laft matter, 4 took the Small Pox afterwards in the natural way, one of whom died, 3 recovered, and the other, being cautioned by me to avoid as much as poffible the chance of catching it, escaped from the difeafe through life. He died of another diforder about 2 years ago. Although one of thefe cafes ended unfortunate, yet I cannot fuppofe that any medical man will think me carelefs or inattentive in their management, for I conceive the appearances were fuch as might have induced any one to fuppofe that the perfons were perfectly fafe from future infection. Inflammation in every cafe took place in the arm, and fever came on with a considerable degree of pain in the axilla. In fome of their arms the inflammation and suppuration were more violent than is commonly obferved when perfect matter is made ufe of. In one there was an ulcer which caft off feveral large floughs. About the 9th day eruptions appeared, which died away earlier than common without maturation. From thefe circumstances I fhould fuppofe that no medical practitioner would fcarcely have entertained a doubt but that thefe patients had been infedted with a true Small Pox, yet I muft confefs that fome fmall degree of doubt prefented itfelf to me at the fpeedy difappearance of the eruptions, and in order, as far as I could, to afcertain their fafety, I fent one of them to a much older practitioner than myfelf. This gentleman, on hearing the circumstance of the cafe, pronounced the patient perfectly fecure from future infection. The following facts are alfo a ftriking proof of the truth of your obfervations on this subject. In the year 1789 I inoculated 3 children of Mr. Coley, of Hurft Farm in this county. The arms inflamed properly, fever and pain in the axilla came on precisely the fame as in the former cafes, and in 10 days eruptions appeared, which difappeared in the courfe of 2 days. I muft obferve that the matter here made ufe of was procured for me by a friend, but no doubt it was in an improper ftate, for, from the similarity of thefe cafes to thofe which happened at Arlingham 5 years before, I was somewhat alarmed for their fafety, and defired to inoculate them again, which being permitted, I was particularly careful to procure matter in its moft perfect ftate. All the children took the Small Pox from this fecond inoculation, and all had a very full burthen. Thefe facts I conceive ftrikingly corroborate your opinion relative to the different ftates of matter, for in both the inftances that I have mentioned it was capable of producing something ftrongly refembling the true Small Pox, although it afterwards proved not to be fo. As I think the communication of thefe cafes is a duty I owe to the public, you are at liberty to make what ufe you pleafe of this letter. I remain, etc. John Earle, Frampton upon Severn, Gloucestershire, November 10th, 1798. P.S. I think it neceffary to obferve, that I can pronounce with the greatest certainty, that the matter with which the Arlingham patients were inoculated was taken from a true Small Pox puftule. I took it myfelf from a subject that had a very full burthen." Certain then it is that variolous matter may undergo fuch a change from the putrefactive procefs, as well as from some of the more obscure and latent processes of nature, as will render it incapable of giving the Small Pox in such a manner as to secure the human constitution from future infection, although we see at the fame time it is capable of exciting a difeafe which bears fo ftrong a refemblance to it, as to produce inflammation and matter in the incifed fkin, frequently indeed more violent than when it produces its effects perfectly, fwelling of the axillary glands, general indifpofition and eruptions. So ftrongly perfuaded was the gentleman, whofe practice I have mentioned in page 51 of the late treatife, that he could produce a mild Small Pox by his mode of managing the matter, that he fpoke of it as a ufeful difcovery, until convinced of his error by the fatal confequence which enfued. After this, ought we to be in the fmalleft degree furprized to find, among a great number of individuals who, by living in dairies, have been cafually expofed to the Cow pox virus when in a ftate analogous to that of the Small Pox above defcribed, fome who may have had the difeafe fo imperfectly as not to render them fecure from variolous attacks? For the matter, when burft from the puftules on the nipples of the cow, by being expofed, from its lodgment there, to the heat of an inflamed surface, and from being, at the fame time, in a fituation to be occafionally moiftened with milk, is often likely to be in a ftate conducive to putrefaction; and thus, under fome modification of decompofition, it muft of courfe fometimes find accefs to the hand of the milker in fuch a way as to infect him. What confufion fhould we have, were there no other mode of inoculating the Small Pox than fuch as would happen from handling the difeafed fkin of a perfon labouring under that diftemper in fome of its advanced and loathfome ftages? It muft be obferved, that every cafe of the Cow Pox in the human fpecies, whether communicated by defign or otherwife, is to be confidered as a cafe of inoculation. And here I may be allowed to make an obfervation on the cafe of the farmer communicated to me by Dr. Ingenhousz. That he was expofed to the matter when it had undergone the putrefactive change, is highly probable from the Doctor's obferving that the fick cows at the farm gave out an offenfive ftench from their udders. However, I muft remark that it is unufual for cattle to fuffer to fuch an extent, when difordered with the Cow Pox, as to make a byftander fenfible of any ill fmell. I have often stood among a herd which had the diftemper without being confcious of its prefence from any particular effluvia. Indeed, in this neighbourhood it commonly receives an early check from efcharotic applications of the cow leech. It has been conceived to be contagious among cows without contact, but this idea cannot be well founded, becaufe the cattle in one meadow do not infect thofe in another, although there may be no other partition than a hedge, unlefs they be handled or milked by thofe who bring the infectious matter with them; and of courfe the fmalleft particle imaginable, when applied to a part fufceptible of its influence, may produce the effect. Among the human fpecies it appears to be very clear that the difeafe is produced by contact only. All my attempts, at leaft, to communicate it by effluvia have hitherto proved ineffectual. As well as the perfect change from that ftate in which variolous matter is capable of producing full and decisive effects on the constitution, to that wherein its fpecific properties are entirely loft, it may reafonably be fuppofed that it is capable of undergoing a variety of immediate changes. The following singular occurrence in 10 cafes of inoculation, obligingly communicated to me by Mr. Trye, Senior Surgeon to the Infirmary at Gloucestershire, seem to indicate that the variolous matter, previoufly to its being taken from the patient for the intended purpofe, was beginning to part with fome of its original properties; or, in other words, that it had suffered a partial decompofition. Mr. Trye fays, "I inoculated 10 children with matter taken at one time, and from the fame fubjedt. I observed no peculiarity in any of them previously to their inoculation, nor did anything remarkable appear in the arms till after the decline of the difeafe. 2 infants of 3 months old had eryfipelas about the incifions, in one of them extending from the fhoulders to the fingers' ends. Another infant had abfcefles in the cellular fubftance in the neighbourhood of the incifions, and 5 or 6 of the reft had axillary abfcefles. The matter was taken from the diftinct Small Pox late in its progrefs, and when fome puftules had been dried. It was received upon glafs, and flowly dried by the fire. All the children had puftules which maturated, fo that I fuppofe them all fecure from future infection, at leaft as fecure as any others whom I have ever inoculated. My practice never afforded a fore arm before." In regard to my former obfervation on the improper and dangerous mode of preferving variolous matter, I fhall here remark, that it feems not to have been clearly understood. Finding that it has been confounded with the more eligible modes of prefervation, I will explain myfelf further. When the matter is taken from a fit puftule, and properly prepared for prefervation, it may certainly be kept without lofing its fpecific properties a great length of time. For inftance, when it is previoufly dried in the open air on fome compact body, as a quill or a piece of glafs, and afterwards fecured in a fmall vial. Thus prepared, the Cow pox virus was found perfectly active, and poffeffing all its fpecific properties at the end of 3 months. But when kept feveral days in a ftate of moifture, and during that time expofed to a warm temperature, I do not think it can be relied upon as capable of giving a perfect difeafe, although, as I have before obferved, the progrefs of the fymptoms arifing from the adtion of the imperfect matter bear fo ftrong a refemblance to the Small Pox when excited completely. Thirdly, that the firft formed virus, or what conftitutes the true Cow pox puftule, invariably poffeffes the power I have afcribed to it, namely, that of affedting the conftitution with a fpecific difeafe, is a truth that no fubfequent occurrence has yet led me to doubt. But as I am now endeavouring to guard the public as much as poffible against erroneous conclusions, I fhall obferve, that when this puftule has degenerated into an ulcer, to which ftate it is fometimes difpofed to pafs unlefs timely checked, I fufpect that matter poffeffing very different properties may fooner or later be produced; and although it may have pafled that ftage wherein the fpecific properties of the matter secreted are no longer prefent in it, yet when applied to a fore, as in the cafual way, it might difpofe that fore to ulcerate, and from its irritation the fyftem would probably become affedted, and thus, by affuming fome of its ftrongeft characters, it would imitate the genuine Cow Pox. From the preceding obfervations on the matter of Small Pox when decompofed, it muft, I conceive, be admitted, that Cow Pox matter in the ftate now described may produce a difeafe, the effedts of which may be felt both locally and generally, yet that the difeafe thus induced may not be effedtual in obviating the future effedts of variolous contagion. In the cafe of Mary Miller, related by Mr. Kite in the volume above alluded to, it appears that the inflammation and suppuration of the inoculated arm were more than ufually fevere, although the fyftem underwent no fpecific change from the adtion of the virus, which appears from the patient's fickening 7 weeks afterwards with the natural Small Pox, which went through its courfe. Some of the cafes communicated by Mr. Earle tend further to confirm this fadt, as the matter there manifeftly produced ulceration on the inoculated part to a considerable extent. Fourthly, whether the Cow Pox is a fpontaneous difeafe in the cow, or is to be attributed to matter conveyed to the animal, as I have conceived, from the horfe, is a queftion which though I shall not attempt now fully to discuss, yet I shall digress so far as to adduce fome farther obfervations, and to give my reafons more at large for taking up an opinion that to fome has appeared fanciful. The aggregate of thefe obfervations, though not amounting to positive proof, forms prefumptive evidence of fo forcible a kind, that I imagine it might on any other perfon have made the fame impreffion it did on me, without fixing the imputation of credulity. Firft, I conceived this was its fource from obferving that where the Cow Pox had appeared among the dairies here, unlefs it could be traced to the introduction of an infedted cow or fervant, it had been preceded at the farm by a horfe difeased in the manner already described, which horfe had been attended by fome of the milkers. Secondly, from its being a popular opinion throughout this great dairy country, and from its being infifted on by thofe who here attend fick cattle. Thirdly, from the total abfence of the difeafe in thofe countries where the men fervants are not employed in the dairies. This information was communicated to me from the firft authorities. Fourthly, from having obferved that morbid matter generated by the horfe frequently communicates, in a cafual way, a difeafe to the human subject fo like the Cow Pox, that in many cafes it would be difficult to make the diftinction between one and the other. The found fkin does not appear to be fufceptible of this virus when inferted into it, but when previoufly difeased from little accidents its effects are often confpicuous. See Plate No. 2. Fifthly, from being induced to fuppofe from experiments that fome of thofe who had been thus affedted from the horfe refilled the Small Pox. Sixthly, from the progrefs and general appearance of the puftule on the arm of the boy whom I inoculated with matter taken from the hand of a man infedted by a horfe, and from the fimilarity to the Cow Pox of the general conftitutional fymptoms which followed. This cafe, on which I laid no inconfiderable ftrefs in my late Treatife, as prefumptive evidence of the fadt adduced, feems to have been either miftaken or overlooked by thofe who have commented upon the subject. See Cafe 18, p. 33. The boy unfortunately died of a fever at a parifh workhoufe before I had an opportunity of obferving what effects would have been produced by the matter of Small Pox. The experiments published by Mr. Symonds of Manchester, and others on the subject, with the view of refuting this theory, appear to have but little weight, as even the Cow Pox virus itfelf, when repeatedly introduced into the found nipples of cows by means of a lancet, was found to produce no effect. I fear it would be trefpaffing too far to adduce the general teftimony of our farmers in fupport of this opinion, yet I beg leave to introduce an extract of a letter on this subject from the Reverend Mr. Moore, of Chelford Hill, in this county. In the month of November 1797, my horfe had difeased heels, which was certainly what is termed the greafe, and at a fhort fubfequent period my cow was alfo affedted with what a neighbouring farmer, who was converfant with the complaints of cattle, pronounced to be the Cow Pox, which he at the fame time obferved my fervant would be infedted with, and this proved to be the cafe, for he had eruptions on his hands, face, and many parts of the body, the puftules appearing large and not much unlike the Small Pox, for which he had been inoculated a year and a half before, and had then a very heavy burthen. The puftules on the face might arife from contact with his hands, as he had a habit of rubbing his forehead, where the fores were the largeft and thickeft. The boy affociated with the farmers' fons during the continuance of the difeafe, neither of whom had had the Small Pox, but they felt no ill effects whatever. he was not much indisposed, as the difeafe did not prevent him from following his occupations as ufual. No other perfons attended the horfe or milked the cow, but the lad above mentioned. I am firmly of opinion that the difeafe in the heels of the horfe, which was a virulent greafe, was the origin of the fervant's and the cow's malady." But to return to the more immediate object of this proposition. From the fimilarity of the fymptoms, both conftitutional and local, between the Cow Pox and the difeafe received from morbid matter generated by a horfe, the common people in this neighbourhood, when infedted with this difeafe, through a ftrange perverfion of terms, frequently called the Cow Pox. Let us fuppofe then fuch a malady to appear among fome of the fervants at a farm, and at the fame time that the Cow Pox were to break out among the cattle. And let us fuppofe too that fome of the fervants were infedted in this way, and that others received the infedtion from the cows. It would be recorded at the farm, and among the fervants themfelves, wherever they might afterwards be difperfed, that they had all had the Cow Pox. But it is clear that an individual thus infedted from the horfe would neither be for a certainty fecure himfelf, nor would he impart fecurity to others were they inoculated by virus thus generated. He ftill would be in danger of taking the Small Pox. Yet were this to happen before the nature of the Cow Pox be more maturely considered by the public, my evidence on the subject might be depreciated unjuftly. For an exemplification of what is here advanced relative to the nature of the infedtion when received diredtly from the horfe, see Inquiry into the Caufes and Effects of the Variolae Vaccinae, pp. 25, 26, 27, 28, and p. 33. And by way of further example, I beg leave to fubjoin the following intelligence received from Mr. Fewfter, Surgeon of Thornbury in this county, a gentleman perfectly well acquainted with the appearance of the Cow Pox on the human subjedt. "William Morris, aged 32, fervant to Mr. Cox of Almondsbury, in this county, applied to me the 2nd of April, 1798. He told me that 4 days before he found a ftiffness and fwelling in both his hands, which were fo painful it was with difficulty he continued his work; that he had been feized with pain in his head, fmall of the back and limbs, and with frequent chilly fits fucceeded by fever. On examination I found him ftill affedted with thefe fymptoms, and that there was a great proftration of ftrength. Many parts of his hands on the infide were chapped, and on the middle joint of the thumb of the right hand there was a fmall phagedænic ulcer, about the fize of a large pea, difcharging with an ichorous fluid. On the middle finger of the fame hand there was another ulcer of a fimilar kind. Thefe fores were of a circular form, and he described their first appearance as being somewhat like blifters arifing from a burn. He complained of exceffive pain which extended up his arm into the axilla. Thefe fymptoms and appearances of the fores were fo exactly like the Cow Pox, that I pronounced he had taken the diftemper from milking cows. He assured me he had not milked a cow for more than half a year, and that his mafter's cows had nothing the matter with them. I then asked him if his mafter had a greafy horfe, which he anfwered in the affirmative, and further said that he had constantly dreffed him twice a day for the laft 3 weeks or more, and remarked that the fmell of his hands was much like that of the horse's heels. On the 5th of April I again faw him, and found him ftill complaining of pain in both his hands, nor were his febrile symptoms at all relieved. The ulcers had now spread to the fize of a 7s. gold coin, and another ulcer, which I had not noticed before, appeared on the first joint of the forefinger of the left hand, equally painful with that on the right. I ordered him to bathe his hands in warm bran and water, applied escharotics to the ulcers, and wrapped his hands up in a soft cataplasm. The next day he was much relieved, and in something more than a fortnight he got well. He lost his nails from the thumb and fingers that were ulcerated." The sudden disappearance of the symptoms in this case, after the application of the escharotics to the sores, is worthy of observation. It seems to show that they were kept up by the irritation of the ulcers. Section 3 of An Inquiry into the Caufes and Effects of the Variolae Vaccinae, by Edward Jenner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jordan Watts, Oxfordshire. Publication 2, Further Observations on the Variolae Vaccinae, Part 2. The general symptoms which I have already described of the Cow Pox, when communicated in a casual way to any great extent, will, I am convinced, from the many cafes I have seen, be found accurate. But from the very slight indifpofition which enfues in cafes of inoculation, where the puftule, after affedting the conftitution, quickly runs into a scab fpontaneously, or is artificially fuppreffed by fome proper application, I am induced to believe that the violence of the symptoms may be ascribed to the inflammation and irritation of the ulcers, when ulceration takes place to any extent, as in the casual Cow Pox, and that the constitutional symptoms which appear during the prefence of the fore, while it affumes the character of a puftule only, are felt but in a very trifling degree. This mild affedtion of the fyftem happens when the difeafe makes but a flight local impreffion on thofe who have been accidentally infedted by cows, and, as far as I have feen, it has uniformly happened among thofe who have been inoculated, when a puftule only, and no great degree of inflammation or any ulceration has taken place from the inoculation. The following cafes will ftrengthen this opinion. The Cow Pox firft appeared at a farm, in the village of Stonehoufe, in this county, about Michaelmas laft, and continued gradually to pafs from one cow to another till the end of November. On the 26th of that month fome ichorous matter was taken from a cow, and dried upon a quill. On the 2nd of December fome of it was inferted into a fcratch, made fo superficial that no blood appeared, on the arm of Susan Phipps, a child 7 years old. The common inflammatory appearances took place in confequence, and advanced till the 5th day, when they had fo much fubfided that I did not conceive any thing further would enfue. 6th. Appearances ftationary. 7th. The inflammation began to advance. 8th. A vefication perceptible on the edges, forming, as in the inoculated Small Pox, an appearance not unlike a grain of wheat, with the cleft or indention in the centre. 9th. Pain in the axilla. 10th. A little headache, pulse 110, tongue not difcoloured, countenance in health. 11th and 12th. No perceptible illness, pulse about 100. 13th. The puftule was now furrounded by an efflorefcence, interfperfed with very minute confluent puftules, to the extent of about an inch. Some of thefe puftules advanced in fize and maturated. So exact was the refemblance of the arm at this ftage to the general appearance of the inoculated Small Pox, that Mr. D., a neighbouring furgeon, who took fome matter from it, and who had never feen the Cow Pox before, declared he could not perceive any difference. That the Cow Pox was a fuppofed guardian of the constitution from the action of the Small Pox has been a prevalent idea for a long time paft, but the similarity in the constitutional effects between one difeafe and the other could never have been fo accurately obferved, had not the inoculation of the Cow Pox placed it in a new and ftronger point of view. This practice too has shewn us what before lay concealed, the rise and progress of the pustule formed by the insertion of the virus, which places in a most conspicuous light its striking refemblance to the pustule formed from the inoculated Small Pox. The child's arm now shewed a dispofition to scab, and remained nearly ftationary for 2 or 3 days, when it began to run into an ulcerous ftate, and then commenced a febrile indifpofition, accompanied with an increafe of axillary tumour. The ulcer continued fpreading near a week, during which time the child continued ill, when it increafed to a fize nearly as large as a shilling. It began now to difcharge pus, granulations fprung up, and it healed. This child had before been of a remarkably fickly conftitution, but is now in very high health. Mary Hearn, 12 years of age, was inoculated with matter taken from the arm of Susan Phipps. 6th day. A puftule began to appear, slight pain in the axilla. 7th. A diftinct veficle formed. 8th. The veficle increafing, edges very red, no deviation in its appearance at this time from the inoculated Small Pox. 9th. No indifpofition, puftule advancing. 10th. The patient felt this evening a flight febrile attack. 11th. Free from indifpofition. 12th and 13th. The fame. 14th. An efflorefcence of a faint red colour, extending feveral inches round the arm. The puftule beginning to shew a difpofition to spread, was dreffed with an ointment compofed of hydrargyrum nitratum rubrum and unguentum cere. The efflorefcence itself was covered with a plafter of unguentum hydrargyri fortius. In 6 hours it was examined, when it was found that the efflorefcence had totally difappeared. The application of the ointment with the hydrargyrum nitratum rubrum was made ufe of for 3 days, when the ftate of the puftule remaining ftationary, it was exchanged for the unguentum hydrargyri nitratis. This appeared to have a more active effect than the former, and in 2 or 3 days the virus seemed to be subdued, when a fimple dreffing was made ufe of; but the fore again fhewing a difpofition to inflame, the unguentum hydrargyri nitratis was again applied, and foon anfwered the intended purpofe effectually. The girl after the 10th day, when, as has been obferved, fhe became a little ill, fhewed not the leaft fymptom of indifpofition. She was afterwards expofed to the action of variolous matter, and completely refilled it. Susan Phipps alfo went through a fimilar trial. Conceiving thefe cafes to be important, I have given them in detail. Firft, to urge the precaution of using fuch means as may ftop the progrefs of the puftule; and secondly, to point out, what appears to be the fadt, that the moft material indifpofition, or at least that which is felt moft fenfibly, does not arife primarily from the firft action of the virus on the conftitution, but that it often comes on, if the puftule is left to chance, as a fecondary difeafe. This leads me to conjecture, what experiment muft finally determine, that they who have had the Small Pox are not afterwards fufceptible of the primary action of the Cow Pox virus. For feeing that the fimple virus itself, when it has not pafled beyond the boundary of a veficle, excites in the fyftem fo little commotion, is it not probable the trifling illness thus induced may be loft in that which fo quickly, and oftentimes fo feverely, follows in the cafual Cow Pox from the prefence of corroding ulcers? This consideration induces me to fuppofe that I may have been miftaken in my former obfervation on this subject. In this refpect, as well as many others, a parallel may be drawn between this difeafe and the Small Pox. In the latter, the patient firft feels the effect of what is called the abforption of the virus. The symptoms then often nearly retire, when a frefh attack commences different from the firft, and the illnefs keeps pace with the progrefs of the puftules through their different stages of maturation, ulceration, etc. Although the application I have mentioned in the cafe of Mary Hearn proved fufficient to check the progrefs of ulceration, and prevent any fecondary symptoms, yet, after the puftule has duly exerted its influence, I fhould prefer the destroying it quickly and effectually to any other mode. The term cauftic to a tender ear, and I conceive none will feel more interefted in this inquiry than the anxious guardians of a nurfery, may found harfh and unpleafing, but every folicitude that may arife on this account will no longer exist, when it is understood that the puftule, in a ftate fit to be acted upon, is then quite superficial, and that it does not occupy the fpace of a filver penny. I mention efcharotics for stopping the progrefs of the puftule, becaufe I am acquainted with their efficacy. Probably more fimple means might anfwer the purpofe quite as well, fuch as might be found among the mineral and vegetable aftringents. As a proof of the efficacy of this practice, even before the virus had fully exerted itself on the fyftem, I fhall lay before my reader the following hiftory. By a reference to the Treatife on the Variolae Vaccinae, it will be feen that in the month of April 1798 4 children were inoculated with the matter of Cow Pox, and that in 2 of thefe cafes the virus on the arm was destroyed foon after it had produced a perceptible fickening. Mary James, aged 7 years, one of the children alluded to, was inoculated in the month of December following with frefh variolous matter, and at the fame time was expofed to the effluvia of a patient affedted with the Small Pox. The appearance and progrefs of the infedted arm was, in every refpect, fimilar to that which we generally obferve when variolous matter has been inferted into the fkin of a perfon who has not previously undergone either the Cow Pox or the Small Pox. On the 8th day, conceiving there was infedtion in it, fhe was removed from her residence among thofe who had not had the Small Pox. I was now anxioufly waiting the refult, conceiving from the ftate of the girl's arm fhe would fall fick about this time. On vifiting her on the evening of the following day, the 9th, all I could learn from the woman who attended her was, that fhe felt fomewhat hotter than ufual during the night, but was not reftlefs, and that in the morning there was a faint appearance of a rafh about her wrifts. This went off in a few hours, and was not at all perceptible to me on my visit in the evening. Not a single eruption appeared, the skin having been repeatedly and carefully examined. The inoculated arm continued to make the ufual progrefs to the end, through all the stages of inflammation, maturation, and scabbing. On the 8th day matter was taken from the arm of this girl, Mary James, and inferted into the arms of her mother and brother, neither of whom had had either the Small Pox or the Cow Pox. The former about 50 years of age, the latter 6. On the 8th day after the infertion, the boy felt indifpofed, and continued unwell 2 days, when a meafles-like rafh appeared on his hands and wrifts, and was thinly scattered over his arms. The day following his body was marbled over with an appearance somewhat fimilar, but he did not complain, nor did he appear indifpofed. A few puftules now appeared, the greater part of which went away without maturating. On the 9th day the mother began to complain. She was a little chilly, and had had a headache for 2 days, but no puftule appeared on the skin, nor had she any appearance of a rafh. The family was attended by an elderly woman as a nurfe, who in her infancy had been expofed to the contagion of the Small Pox, but had refitted it. This woman was now infedted, but had the difeafe in the flightest manner, a very few eruptions appearing, 2 or 3 of which only maturated. From a solitary inftance like that adduced of Mary James, whofe constitution appears to have refitted the adtion of the variolous virus, after the influence of the cowpox virus had been so soon arrested in its progress, no positive conclusion can be fairly drawn, nor from the history of the 3 other patients who were subsequently infected, but nevertheless the facts collectively may be deemed interesting. That one mild variety of the Small Pox has appeared I have already plainly shewn, and by the means now mentioned we probably may have it in our power to produce at will another. At the time when the puftule was destroyed in the arm of Mary James, I was informed fhe had been indifpofed about 12 hours, but I am now assured by thofe who were with her that the fpace of time was much lefs. Be that as it may, in cafes of Cow Pox inoculation I would not recommend any application to fubdue the adtion of the puftule, until convincing proofs have appeared of the patient's having felt its effects at leaft 12 hours. No harm indeed could enfue were a longer period to elapse before the application was made ufe of. In short, it fhould be suffered to have as full an effect as it could, confiftently with the ftate of the arm. As the cafes of inoculation multiply, I am more and more convinced of the extreme mildness of the fymptoms arifing merely from the primary adtion of the virus on the conftitution, and that thofe fymptoms which, as in the accidental Cow Pox, affect the patient with feverity, are entirely fecondary, excited by the irritating procefles of inflammation and ulceration, and it appears to me that this singular virus poffefles an irritating quality of a peculiar kind, but as a single Cow Pox puftule is all that is neceffary to render the variolous virus ineffectual, and as we poffefs the means of allaying the irritation, fhould any arife, it becomes of little or no confequence. It appears then, as far as an inference can be drawn from the prefent progrefs of Cow Pox inoculation, that it is an accidental circumftance only which can render this a violent difeafe, and a circumftance of that nature, which fortunately it is in the power of almost every one to avoid. I allude to the communication of the difeafe from cows. In this cafe, fhould the hands of the milker be affected with little accidental fores to any extent, every fore would become the nidus of infedtion, and feel the influence of the virus, and the degree of violence in the conftitutional fymptoms would be in proportion to the number and to the ftate of thefe local affections. Hence it follows that a perfon, either by accident or defign, might be fo filled with thefe wounds from contact with the virus, that the conftitution might fink under the preffure. Seeing that we poffefs the means of rendering the adtion of the fores mild, which, when left to chance, are capable of producing violent effects, and feeing too that thefe fores bear a refemblance to the Small Pox, especially the confluent, fhould it not encourage the hope that fome topical application might be used with advantage to counteract the fatal tendency of that difeafe, when it appears in this terrific form? At what ftage or ftages of the difeafe this may be done with the most promifing expectation of fuccefs, I will not pretend now to determine. I can only throw out this idea as the bafis of further reafoning and experiment. I have often been foiled in my endeavours to communicate the Cow Pox by inoculation. An inflammation will fometimes succeed the fcratch or puncture, and in a few days difappear without producing any further effect. Sometimes it will even produce an ichorous fluid, and yet the fyftem will not be affected. At this point of the inquiry I had not difcovered the importance of inoculating with virus newly formed in the puftule. The reader will find this explained as he proceeds. The fame thing we know happens with the Small Pox virus. 4 or 5 fervants were inoculated at a farm contiguous to this place, laft fummer, with matter juft taken from an infected cow. A little inflammation appeared on all their arms, but died away without producing a puftule. Yet all thefe fervants caught the difeafe within a month afterwards from milking the infected cows, and fome of them had it feverely. At prefent no other mode than that commonly practifed for inoculating the Small Pox has been ufed for giving the Cow Pox, but it is probable this might be varied with advantage. We should imitate the cafual communication more clearly, were we firft, by making the fmalleft fuperficial incifion or puncture on the skin to produce a little scab, and then, removing it, to touch the abraded part with the virus. A fmall portion of a thread imbrued with the virus, as in the old method of inoculating the Small Pox, and laid upon the flightly incifed skin, might probably prove a fuccessful way of giving the difeafe. Or the cutis might be expofed in a minute point by an atom of bliftering plafter, and the virus brought into contact with it. In the cafes juft alluded to, where I did not fucceed in giving the difeafe conftitutionally, the experiment was made with matter taken in a purulent ftate from the puftule of the nipple of a cow. * The caufe of thefe difappointments will be explained. Is pure pus, though contained in a Small Pox puftule, ever capable of producing the Small Pox perfectly? I fufpect it is not. Let us confider that it is always preceded by the limpid fluid, which, in conftitutions fufceptible to variolous contagion, is always infectious; and though, on opening a puftule, its contents may appear perfectly purulent, yet a given quantity of the limpid fluid may at the fame time be blended with it, though it would be imperceptible to the only teft of our fences, the eye. The prefence then of this fluid, or its mechanical diffufion through pus, may at all times render active what is apparently mere pus, while its total abfence, as in ftale puftules, may be attended with the imperfect effects we have feen. It would be digreffing too wildly to go far into the doctrine of secretion, but as it will not be quite extraneous, I fhall juft obferve, that I confider both the pus and the limpid fluid of the puftule as secretions, but that the organs eftablifhed by nature to perform the office of secreting thefe fluids may differ effentially in their mechanical ftructure. What but a difference in the organization of glandular bodies conftitutes the difference in the qualities of the fluid secreted? From fome peculiar derangement in the ftructure, or in other words fome deviation in the natural adtion of a gland destined to secrete a mild, innoxious fluid, a poifon of the moft deadly nature may be created. For example, that gland which in its found ftate secretes pure saliva, may, from being thrown into difeafed adtion, produce a poifon of the moft deftructive quality. Nature appears to have no more difficulty in forming minute glands among the vafcular parts of the body than fhe has in forming blood veffels, and millions of thefe can be called into existence when inflammation is excited, in a few hours. Mr. Home, in his excellent differtation on pus and mucus, juftifies this affertion. In the prefent early ftage of the inquiry, for early it certainly muft be deemed, before we know for an abfolute certainty how foon the virus of the Cow Pox may fuffer a change in its fpecific properties, after it has quitted the limpid ftate it poffeffed when forming a puftule, it would be prudent for thofe who have been inoculated with it to submit to variolous inoculation. No injury or inconvenience can accrue from this, and were the fame method practifed among thofe who, from inoculation, have felt the Small Pox in an unsatisfactory manner at any period of their lives, it might appear that I had not been too officious in offering a cautionary hint, in recommending a fecond inoculation with matter in its moft perfect ftate. And here let me fuppofe, for argument's fake, not from conviction, that one perfon in 100, after having had the Cow Pox, fhould be found fufceptible of the Small Pox, would this invalidate the utility of the practice? For, waiving all other considerations, who will deny that the inoculated Small Pox, though abftradly it may be considered as harmless, does not involve in itself something that in numberless inftances proves baneful to the human frame. That in delicate constitutions it sometimes excites scrofula is a fact that muft generally be fubscribed to, as it is fo obvious to common obfervation. This consideration is important. As the effects of the Small Pox inoculation on thofe who have had the Cow Pox will be watched with the moft scrupulous eye by thofe who profecute this inquiry, it may be proper to bring to their recollection fome facts relative to the Small Pox, which I muft confider here as of confequence, but which hitherto feem not to have made a due impreffion. It should be remembered that the constitution cannot by previous infection be rendered totally unfufceptible of the variolous poifon. Neither the cafual nor the inoculated Small Pox, whether it produces the difeafe in a mild or in a violent way, can perfectly extinguish the fufceptibility. The skin, we know, is ever ready to exhibit, though often in a very limited degree, the effect of the poifon when inferted there, and how frequently do we fee among nurfes, when much expofed to the contagion, eruptions, and thefe fometimes preceded by fenfible illnefs. Yet fhould anything like an eruption appear, or the fmalleft degree of indifpofition, upon the infertion of the variolous matter on thofe who have gone through the Cow Pox, my affertions refpedting the peculiarities of the difeafe might be unjuftly difcredited. I know a gentleman who many years ago was inoculated for the Small Pox, but having no puftules, or fcarcely any conftitutional affection that was perceptible, he was difsatisfied, and since has been repeatedly inoculated. A veficle has always been produced in the arm in confequence, with axillary fwelling and a flight indifpofition. This is by no means a rare occurrence. It is probable that the fluid thus excited upon the fkin would always produce the Small Pox. On the arm of a perfon who had gone through the Cow Pox, many years before, I once produced a vefication by the infertion of variolous matter, and with a little of the fluid inoculated a young woman, who had a mild but very efficacious Small Pox in confequence, although no conftitutional effect was produced on the patient from whom the matter was taken. The following communication from Mr. Fewster affords a ftill clearer elucidation of this fact. Mr. Fewster fays, quote, "On the 3rd of April, 1797, I inoculated Mafter H, aged 14 months, for the Small Pox. At the ufual time he fickened, had a plentiful eruption, particularly on his face, and got well. His nurfemaid, aged 24, had many years before gone through the Small Pox in the natural way, which was evident from her being much pitted with it. She had used the child to sleep on her left arm, with her left cheek in contact with his face, and during his inoculation he had moftly slept in that manner. About a week after the child got well, she (the nurfe) desired me to look at her face, which fhe said was very painful. There was a plentiful eruption on the left cheek, but not on any other part of the body, which went on to maturation. On inquiry I found that 3 days before the appearance of the eruption fhe was taken with flight chilly fits, pain in her head and limbs, and fome fever. On the appearance of the eruptions thefe pains went off, and now, the 2nd day of the eruption, fhe complains of a little fore throat. Whether the above fymptoms are the effects of the Small Pox or of a recent cold, I do not know. On the 5th day of the eruption I charged a lancet from 2 of the puftules, and on the next day I inoculated 2 children, one 2 years, the other 4 months old, with the matter. At the fame time I inoculated the mother and eldeft fifter with variolous matter taken from Mafter H. On the 5th day of their inoculation all their arms were inflamed alike, and on the 8th day the eldeft of thofe inoculated from the nurfe fickened, and the youngeft on the 11th. They had both a plentiful eruption, from which I inoculated feveral others, who had the difeafe very favourably. The mother and the other child sickened about the fame time, and likewife had a plentiful eruption. Soon after a man in the village fickened with the Small Pox, and had a confluent kind. To be convinced that the children had had the difeafe effectually, I took them to his houfe and inoculated them in both arms with matter taken from him, but without effect." Thefe are not brought forward as uncommon occurrences, but as exemplifications of the human fyftem's fufceptibility of the variolous contagion, although it has been previoufly fenfible of its action. Happy is it for mankind that the appearance of the Small Pox a fecond time on the fame perfon beyond a trivial extent is fo extremely rare that it is looked upon as a phenomenon. Indeed, since the publication of Dr. Heberden's paper on the Variolae or Chicken Pox, the idea of fuch an occurrence, in deference to authority fo truly respectable, has been generally relinquished. This I conceive has been without juft reafon, for after we have feen, among many other things, fo ftrong a cafe as that recorded by Mr. Edward Withers, Surgeon, of Newbury, Berkshire, in the 4th volume of the Memoirs of the Medical Society of London, from which I take the following extracts, no one I think will again doubt the fact. "Mr. Richard Langford, a farmer of West Shefford in this county (Berkshire), about 5 years of age, when about a month old, had the Small Pox at a time when 3 others of the family had the fame difeafe, one of whom, a fervant man, died of it. Mr. Langford's countenance was ftrongly indicative of the malignity of the diftemper, his face being fo remarkably pitted and feamed, as to attract the notice of all who faw him, fo that no one could entertain a doubt of his having had that difeafe in a moft inveterate manner." Mr. Withers proceeds to ftate that Mr. Langford was feized a fecond time, had a bad confluent Small Pox, and died on the 21st day from the feizure, and that 4 of the family, as alfo a fifter of the patient's, to whom the difeafe was conveyed by her fon's vifiting his uncle falling down with the Small Pox, fully fatisfied the country with regard to the nature of the difeafe, which nothing short of this would have done, the fifter died. "This cafe was thought fo extraordinary a one as to induce the rector of the parifh to record the particulars in the parifh regifter." It is singular that in moft cafes of this kind the difeafe in the firft inftance has been confluent, fo that the extent of the ulceration of the fkin, as in the Cow Pox, is not the procefs in nature which affords security to the constitution. As the fubject of the Small Pox is fo interwoven with that which is the more immediate object of my prefent concern, it muft plead my excufe for fo often introducing it. At prefent it muft be considered as a diftemper not well understood. The inquiry I have instituted into the nature of the Cow Pox will probably promote its more perfect inveftigation. The inquiry of Dr. Pearfon into the hiftory of the Cow Pox, having produced fo great a number of atteftations in favour of my affertion that it proves a protection to the human body from the Small Pox, I have not been affiduous in feeking for more, but as fome of my friends have been fo good as to communicate the following, I fhall conclude thefe obfervations with their infertion. Extract of a letter from Mr. Drake, Surgeon, at Stroud, in this county, and late Surgeon to the North Gloucester Regiment of Militia. "In the fpring of the year 1796, I inoculated men, women, and children, to the amount of about 70. Many of the men did not receive the infection, although inoculated at least 3 times, and kept in the fame room with thofe who actually underwent the difeafe during the whole time occupied by them in paffing through it. Being anxious they fhould in future be fecure against it, I was very particular in my inquiries to find out whether they ever had previously had it, or at any time been in the neighbourhood of people labouring under it. but after all, the only satisfactory information I could obtain was, that they had had the cow pox. As I was then ignorant of such a difeafe affecting the human subject, I flattered myfelf what they imagined to be the Cow Pox was in reality the Small Pox in a very flight degree. I mentioned the circumftance in the prefence of feveral of the officers, at the fame time expreffing my doubts if it were not Small Pox, and was not a little furprized when I was told by the Colonel, that he had frequently heard you mention the Cow Pox as a difeafe endemial to Gloucefterfhire, and that if a perfon were ever affedted by it, you fuppofed him afterwards fecure from the Small Pox. This excited my curiofity, and when I vifited Gloucefterfhire, I was very inquifitive concerning the subject, and from the information I have fince received, both from your publication and from converfation with medical men of the greateft accuracy in their obfervations, I am fully convinced that what the men fuppofed to be the Cow Pox was actually fo, and I can safely affirm that they effectually refilled the Small Pox." Mr. Fry, Surgeon at Durfley, in this county, favours me with the following communication: "During the fpring of the year 1797, I inoculated 1475 patients, of all ages, from a fortnight old to 70 years, amongst whom there were many who had previously gone through the Cow Pox. The exact number I cannot ftate, but if I fay there were near 30, I am certain with the number. There was not a fingle inftance of the variolous matter producing any conftitutional effect on thefe people, nor any greater degree of local inflammation than it would have done in the arm of a perfon who had before gone through the Small Pox, notwithstanding it was invariably inferted 4, 5, and fometimes 6 different times to fatisfy the minds of the patients. In the common courfe of inoculation previous to the general one, fcarcely a year pafled without my meeting with 1 or 2 inftances of perfons who had gone through the Cow Pox, refilling the actions of the variolous contagion. I may fairly fay that the number of people I have feen inoculated with the Small Pox, who at former periods had gone through the Cow Pox, are not lefs than 40. The greater part of thefe people muft of courfe have had the Cow Pox many years before this trial was made upon them with the matter of Small Pox. And in no one inftance have I known a patient receive the Small Pox, notwithstanding they invariably continued to affociate with other inoculated patients during the progrefs of the difeafe, and many of them purpofely expofed themfelves to the contagion of the natural Small Pox, whence I am fully convinced that a perfon who had fairly had the Cow Pox is no longer capable of being acted upon by the variolous matter. I alfo inoculated a very considerable number of thofe who had had the difeafe which ran through the neighbourhood a few years ago, and was called by the common people the Swine Pox, not one of whom received the Small Pox. This was that mild variety of the Small Pox which I have noticed in the late treatife on the Cow Pox, p. 49. There were about half a dozen inftances of people who never had either the Cow or Swine Pox, yet did not receive the Small Pox, the fyftem not being in the leaft deranged, or the arms inflamed, although they were repeatedly inoculated, and affociated with others who were labouring under the difeafe. One of them was the fon of a farrier." Mr. Tierney, Affiftant Surgeon of the South Gloucester Regiment of Militia, has obliged me with the following information: "That in the fummer of the year 1798 he inoculated a great number of men belonging to the regiment, and that among them he found 11 who, from having lived in dairies, had gone through the Cow Pox; that all of them refilled the Small Pox except one, but that, on making the most rigid and scrupulous inquiry at the farm in Gloucestershire, where the man said he lived when he had the difeafe, and among thofe with whom at the fame time he declared he had affociated, and particularly of a perfon in the parifh whom he said had dreffed his fingers, it most clearly appeared that he aimed at an imposition, and that he never had been affected with the cow-pox. Footnote: the public cannot be too much on their guard respecting persons of this description. End of footnote. Mr. Tierney remarks that the arms of many who were inoculated after having had the cow-pox inflamed very quickly, and that in several a little ichorous fluid was formed. End quote. Mr. Klein, who in July last was so obliging, at my request, as to try the efficacy of the cow-pox virus, was kind enough to give me a letter on the result of it, from which the following is an extract. Quote, "My dear Sir, the cow-pox experiment has succeeded admirably. The child sickened on the 7th day, and the fever, which was moderate, subsided on the 11th. The inflammation arising from the insertion of the virus extended to about 4 inches in diameter, and then gradually subsided, without having been attended with pain or other inconvenience. There were no eruptions. I have since inoculated him with small-pox matter in 3 places, which were slightly inflamed on the 3rd day, and then subsided. Dr. Lister, who was formerly physician to the small-pox hospital, attended the child with me, and he is convinced that it is not possible to give him the small-pox. I think the substituting the cow-pox poison for the small-pox promises to be one of the greatest improvements that has ever been made in medicine, and the more I think on the subject, the more I am impressed with its importance. With great esteem, I am, etc., Henry Klein." End quote. Lincoln's Inn Fields, August 2nd, 1798. From communications with which I have been favoured from Dr. Pearson, who has occasionally reported to me the result of his private practice with the vaccine virus in London, and from Dr. Woodville, who has also favoured me with an account of his more extensive inoculation with the same virus at the small-pox hospital, it appears that many of their patients have been affected with eruptions, and that these eruptions have maturated in a manner very similar to the variolous. The matter they made use of was taken, in the first instance, from a cow belonging to one of the great milk farms in London. Having never seen maturated pustules produced either in my own practice among those who were carefully infected by cows, or those to whom the disease had been communicated by inoculation, I was desirous of seeing the effect of the matter generated in London on subjects living in the country. A thread imbrued in some of this matter was sent to me, and with it 2 children were inoculated, whose cases I shall transcribe from my notes. Stephen Jenner, 3 years and a half old. 3rd day. The arm showed a proper and decisive inflammation. 6th. A vesicle arising. 7th. The pustule of a cherry colour. 8th. Increasing in elevation. A few spots now appear on each arm near the insertion of the inferior tendons of the biceps muscles. They are very small, and of a vivid red colour. The pulse natural, the tongue of its natural hue, no loss of appetite or any symptoms of indisposition. 9th. The inoculated pustule on the arm this evening began to inflame, and gave the child uneasiness. He cried and pointed to the feet of it, and was immediately afterwards affected with febrile symptoms. At the expiration of 2 hours after the seizure, a plaister of unguentum hydrargyri fortius was applied, and its effect was very quickly perceptible. For in 10 minutes he resumed his usual looks and playfulness. On examining the arm about 3 hours after the application of the plaister, its effects in subduing the inflammation were very manifest. 10th. The spots on the arms have disappeared, but there are 3 visible in the face. 11th. 2 spots on the face are gone, the other barely perceptible. 13th. The pustule delineated in the 2nd plate in the treatise on the Variolae Vaccinae is a correct representation of that on the child's arm, as it appears at this time. 14th. 2 fresh spots appear on the face, the pustule on the arm nearly converted into a scab, As long as any fluid remained in it, it was limpid. James Hill, 4 years old, was inoculated on the same day, and with part of the same matter which infected Stephen Jenner. It did not appear to have taken effect till the 5th day. 7th. A perceptible veficle. This evening the patient became a little chilly. No pain or tumour discoverable in the axilla. 8th. Perfectly well. 9th. The fame. 10th. The veficle more elevated than I have been accuftomed to fee it, and affuming more perfectly the variolous character than is common with the Cow Pox at this ftage. 11th. Surrounded by an inflammatory redness, about the fize of a shilling, studded over with minute vesicles. The puftule contained a limpid fluid till the 14th day, after which it was encrufted over in the ufual manner, but this incruftation or scab being accidentally rubbed off, it was flow in healing. Thefe children were afterwards fully expofed to the Small Pox contagion without effect. Having been requested by my friend Mr. Henry Hicks, of Eastington, in this county, to inoculate 2 of his children, and at the fame time fome of his fervants and the people employed in his manufactory, matter was taken from the arm of this boy for the purpofe. The numbers inoculated were 18. They all took the infection, and either on the 5th or 6th day a veficle was perceptible on the punctured part. Some of them began to feel a little unwell on the 8th day, but the greater number on the 9th. Their illness, as in the former cafes described, was of short duration, and not fufficient to interrupt, but at very short intervals, the children from their amufements, or the fervants and manufacturers from following their ordinary bufinefs. 3 of the children, whofe employment in the manufactory was in fome degree laborious, had an inflammation on their arms beyond the common boundary about the 11th or 12th day, when the feverifh fymptoms, which before were nearly gone off, again returned, accompanied with an increafe of axillary tumour. In thefe cafes, clearly perceiving the fymptoms were governed by the ftate of the arms, I applied on the inoculated puftules, and renewed the application 3 or 4 times within an hour, a pledget of lint, previously soaked in aqua lithargii acetate, Goulard's extract of Saturn, and covered the hot efflorefcence surrounding them with cloths dipped in cold water. The next day I found that this fimple mode of treatment had fucceeded perfectly. The inflammation was nearly gone off, and with it the fymptoms which it had produced. Some of thefe patients have since been inoculated with variolous matter without any effect beyond a little inflammation on the part where it was inferted. Why the arms of thofe inoculated with the vaccine matter in the country fhould be more difpofed to inflame than thofe inoculated in London, it may be difficult to determine. From comparing my own cafes to fome transmitted to me by Dr. Pearfon and Dr. Woodville, this appears to be the fact. And what ftrikes me as still more extraordinary with refpedt to thofe inoculated in London is, the appearance of maturating eruptions. In the 2 inftances only which I have mentioned, the one from the inoculated, the other from the casual Cow Pox, a few red spots appeared, which quickly went off without maturating. The cafe of the Reverend Mr. Moore's fervant may indeed feem like a deviation from the common appearances in the country, but the nature of thefe eruptions was not ascertained beyond their not poffeffing the property of communicating the difeafe by their effluvia. Perhaps the difference we perceive in the ftate of the arms may be owing to fome variety in the mode of action of the virus upon the fkin of thofe who breathe the air of London and thofe who live in the country. That the eryfipelas affumes a different form in London from what we fee it put on in the country, is a fact very generally acknowledged. In calling the inflammation that is excited by the Cow Pox virus erysipelatous, perhaps I may not be critically exact, but it certainly approaches near to it. Now, As the difeased action going forward in the part infedted with the virus may undergo different modifications according to the peculiarities of the conftitution on which it is to produce its effect, may it not account for the variation which has been obferved? To this it may probably be objected that fome of the patients inoculated, and who had puftules in confequence, were newly come from the country. But I conceive that the changes wrought in the human body through the medium of the lungs may be extremely rapid. Yet, after all, further experiments made in London with vaccine virus generated in the country muft finally throw a light on what now certainly appears obscure and mylerious. The principal variation perceptible to me in the action of the vaccine virus generated in London from that produced in the country, was its proving more certainly infectious, and giving a less difpofition in the arm to inflame. There appears alfo a greater elevation of the puftule above the furrounding fkin. In my former cafes the puftule produced by the infertion of the virus was more like one of thofe which are fo thickly fpread over the body in a bad cafe of confluent Small Pox. This was more like a puftule of the diftinct Small Pox, except that I faw no inftance of pus being formed in it, the matter remaining limpid till the period of fcabbing. Wishing to fee the effects of the difeafe on an infant newly born, my nephew, Mr. Henry Jenner, at my request, inferted the vaccine virus into the arm of a child about 20 hours old. His report to me is, that the child went through the difeafe without apparent illness, yet that it was found effectually to refift the action of variolous matter with which it was subfequently inoculated. I have had an opportunity of trying the effects of the Cow Pox matter on a boy who, the day preceding its infertion, fickened with the meafles. The eruption of the meafles, attended with cough, a little pain in the cheft, and the ufual fymptoms accompanying that difeafe, appeared on the third day, and spread all over him. The difeafe went through its courfe without any deviation from its ufual habits, and, notwithstanding this, the Cow Pox virus excited its common appearances, both on the arm and on the conftitution, without any fenfible interruption. On the 6th day there was a veficle. 8th. Pain in the axilla, chilly, and affected with headache. 9th. Nearly well. 12th. The puftule spread to the fize of a large split pea, but without any furrounding efflorefcence. It foon afterwards fcabbed, and the boy recovered his general health rapidly. But it should be obferved, that before it fcabbed, the efflorefcence, which had suffered a temporary fufpenfion, advanced in the ufual manner. Here we fee a deviation from the ordinary habits of the Small Pox, as it has been obferved that the prefence of the meafles fufpends the action of variolous matter. However, the fufpenfion of the efflorefcence is worthy of obfervation. The very general investigation that is now taking place, chiefly through inoculation, and I again repeat my earnest hope that it may be conducted with that calmness and moderation which should ever accompany a philosophical refearch, muft foon place the vaccine difeafe in its juft point of view. The refult of all my trials with the virus on the human subject has been uniform. In every inftance, the patient who has felt its influence has completely lost the fufceptibility for the variolous contagion; and as thefe inftances are now become numerous, I conceive that, joined to the obfervations in the former part of this paper, they sufficiently preclude me from the neceffity of entering into controversies with thofe who have circulated reports adverfe to my affertions, on no other evidence than what has been cafually collected. Section 4 of an Inquiry into the Caufes and Effects of the Variolae Vaccinae, by Edward Jenner. This recording is in the Public Domain. Recording by Jordan Watts, Oxfordshire. Publication 3. A continuation of facts and obfervations relative to the Variolae Vaccinae, or cowpox. Since my former publications on the vaccine inoculation, I have had the satisfaction of seeing it extend very widely. Not only in this country is the subject pursued with ardour, but from my correspondence with many respectable medical gentlemen on the Continent, among whom are Dr. de Caro of Vienna and Dr. Bullhorn of Hanover, I find it is as warmly adopted abroad where it has afforded the greatest satisfaction. I have the pleasure too of seeing that the feeble efforts of a few individuals to depreciate the new practice are sinking fast into contempt beneath the immense mass of evidence which has risen up in support of it. Upwards of 6,000 persons have now been inoculated with the virus of cow pox, and the far greater part of them have since been inoculated with that of small pox, and exposed to its infection in every rational way that could be devised, without effect. It was very improbable that the investigation of a difease so analogous to the small pox should go forward without engaging the attention of the physician of the Small Pox Hospital in London. Accordingly, Dr. Woodville, who fills that department with so much respectability, took an early opportunity of instituting an inquiry into the nature of the cow pox. This inquiry was began in the early part of the present year, and in May Dr. Woodville published the result, which differs essentially from mine in a point of much importance. It appears that 3/5 of the patients inoculated were affected with eruptions, for the most part so perfectly resembling the small pox as not to be distinguished from them. On this subject it is necessary that I should make some comments. When I consider that out of the great number of cafes of casual inoculation immediately from cows, which have from time to time prefented themfelves to my obfervation, and the many fimilar inftances which have been communicated to me by medical gentlemen in this neighbourhood; when I confider too that the matter with which my inoculations were conducted in the years 1797, '98, and '99 was taken from different cows, and that in no inftance anything like a variolous puftule appeared, I cannot feel difpofed to imagine that eruptions, fimilar to thofe described by Dr. Woodville, have ever been produced by the pure uncontaminated cow pox virus. On the contrary, I do fuppofe that thofe which the Doctor speaks of originated in the adtion of variolous matter, which crept into the conftitution with the vaccine. And this I prefume happened from the inoculation of a great number of the patients with variolous matter, fome on the 3rd, others on the 5th day, after the vaccine had been applied; and it should be obferved that the matter thus propagated became the fource of future inoculations in the hands of many medical gentlemen who appeared to have been previously unacquainted with the nature of the cow pox. Another circumftance ftrongly, in my opinion, fupporting this fuppofition, is the following. The cow pox has been known among our dairies time immemorial. If puftules then, like the variolous, were to follow the communication of it from the cow to the milker, would not fuch a fadt have been known and recorded at our farms? Yet neither our farmers nor the medical people of the neighbourhood have noticed fuch an occurrence. A few scattered pimples I have fometimes, though very rarely feen, the greatest part of which have generally difappeared quickly, but fome have remained long enough to fuppurate at their apex. That local cuticular inflammation, whether fpringing up fpontaneously or arifing from the application of acrid substances, fuch, for inftance, as cantharides, Pix burgundica, Antimonium tartarizatum, etc., will often produce cutaneous affections, not only near the feat of the inflammation, but on fome parts of the skin far beyond its boundary, is a well known fadt. It is, doubtlefs, on this principle that the inoculated cow pox puftule and its concomitant efflorefcence may, in very irritable conftitutions, produce this affection. The eruption I allude to has commonly appeared fome time in the 3rd week after inoculation. but this appearance is too trivial to excite the least regard. The change which took place in the general appearance during the progress of the vaccine inoculation at the smallpox hospital should likewise be considered. Although at first it took on so much of the variolous character as to produce pustules in 3 cases out of 5, yet in Dr. Woodville's last report published in June, he says, "Since the publication of my reports of inoculations for the cow pox, upwards of 300 cases have been under my care, and out of this number only 39 had pustules that suppurated; namely, out of the first 100, 19 had pustules, out of the second, 13, and out of the last 110 only 7 had pustules. Thus it appears that the difease has become considerably milder, which I am inclined to attribute to a greater caution used in the choice of the matter, with which the infection was communicated, for lately that which has been employed for this purpofe has been taken only from thofe patients in whom the Cow Pox proved very mild and well characterized." In a few weeks after the Cow Pox inoculation was introduced at the Small Pox Hofpital, I was favoured with fome virus from this stock. In the firft inftance it produced a few puftules, which did not maturate, but in the subfequent cafes none appeared. The inference I am induced to draw from thefe premifes is very different. The decline, and finally the total extinction nearly, of thefe puftules, in my opinion, are far more attributable to the Cow Pox virus assimilating the variolous. In my firft publication on this subject I expreffed an opinion that the Small Pox and the Cow Pox were the fame difeafe under different modifications. In this opinion Dr. Woodville has concurred. The axiom of the immortal Hunter, that 2 difeafed actions cannot take place at the fame time in one and the fame part, will not be injured by the admiffion of this theory. The former probably being the original, the latter the fame difeafe under a peculiar, and at prefent an inexplicable modification. One experiment tending to elucidate the point under difcuffion, I had myfelf the opportunity of inftituting. On the fuppofition of its being poffible that the cow which ranges over the fertile meadows in the Vale of Glouceftershire might generate a virus differing in fome refpedts in its qualities from that produced by the animal artificially pampered for the production of milk for the metropolis, I procured, during my residence there in the fpring, fome Cow Pox virus from a cow at one of the London milk farms. It was taken by Mr. Tanner, then a student at the Veterinary College, from a cow at Mr. Clarke's farm in Kentish Town. It was immediately conveyed into Glouceftershire by Dr. Marshall, who was then extenfively engaged in the inoculation of the Cow Pox, the general refult of which, and the inoculation in particular with this matter, I fhall lay before my readers in the following communication from the Doctor. "Dear Sir, My neighbour, Mr. Hicks, having mentioned your wifh to be informed of the progrefs of the inoculation here for the Cow Pox, and he alfo having taken the trouble to transmit to you my minutes of the cafes which have fallen under my care, I hope you will pardon the further trouble I now give you in ftating the obfervations I have made upon the subject. When firft informed of it, having 2 children who had not had the Small Pox, I determined to inoculate them for the Cow Pox whenever I fhould be fo fortunate as to procure matter proper for the purpofe. I was therefore particularly happy when I was informed that I could procure matter from fome of thofe whom you had inoculated. In the firft inftance I had no intention of extending the difeafe further than my own family, but the very extenfive influence which the conviction of its efficacy in refilling the Small Pox has had upon the minds of the people in general, has rendered that intention nugatory, as you will perceive by the continuation of my Cafes enclofed in this letter. Dr. Marshall has detailed thefe cafes with great accuracy, but their publication would be deemed fuperfluous. by which it will appear that since the 22nd of March I have inoculated 107 persons, which, considering the retired situation I reside in, is a very great number. There are also other considerations which, besides that of its influence in resisting the small pox, appear to have had their weight, namely, the peculiar mildness of the difeafe, the known fafety of it, and its not having in any inftance prevented the patient from following his ordinary bufinefs. In all the cafes under my care, there have only occurred 2 or 3 which required any application owing to eryfipelatous inflammation on the arm, and they immediately yielded to it. In the remainder the conftitutional illness has been flight but sufficiently marked, and considerably lefs than I ever obferved in the fame number inoculated with the Small Pox. In only 1 or 2 of thefe cafes have any other eruptions appeared than thofe around the spot where the matter was infedted, and thofe near the infedted part. Neither does there appear in the Cow Pox to be the leaft exciting caufe to any other difeafe, which in the Small Pox has been frequently obferved, the conftitution remaining in as full health and vigour after the termination of the difeafe as before the infedtion. Another important consideration appears to be the impoffibility of the difeafe being communicated, except by the actual contadt of the matter of the puftule, and confequently the perfect fafety of the remaining part of the family, fuppofing only 1 or 2 fhould wifh to be inoculated at the fame time. Upon the whole, it appears evident to me that the Cow Pox is a pleafanter, fhorter, and infinitely more fafe difeafe than the inoculated Small Pox, when conducted in the moft careful and approved manner. Neither is the local affedtion of the inoculated part or the conftitutional illness near fo violent. I fpeak with confidence on the subject, having had an opportunity of obferving its effect upon a variety of conftitutions, from 3 months old to 60 years, and to which I have paid particular attention. In the cafes alluded to here you will obferve that the removal from the original fource of the matter has made no alteration or change in the nature or appearance of the difeafe, and that it may be continued ad infinitum, I imagine, from one perfon to another, if care be obferved in taking the matter at a proper period, without any neceffity of recurring to the original matter of the cow. I fhould be happy if any endeavours of mine could tend further to elucidate the subject, and fhall be much gratified in fending you any further obfervations I may be enabled to make. I have the pleafure to subscribe myfelf, Dear Sir, etc. Joseph H. Marshall. Eastington, Gloucestershire, April 26th, 1799. The gentleman who favoured me with the above account has continued to profecute his inquiries with unremitting induftry, and has communicated the refult in another letter, which at his request I lay before the public without abbreviation. Dr. Marshall's Second Letter. Dear Sir, Since the date of my former letter, I have continued to inoculate with the Cow Pox virus. Including the cafes before enumerated, the number now amounts to 423. It would be tedious and ufelefs to detail the progrefs of the difeafe in each individual. It is sufficient to obferve, that I noticed no deviation in any respect from the cafes I formerly adduced. The general appearance of the arm exactly corresponded with the account given in your firft publication. When they were difpofed to become troublesome by eryfipelatous inflammation, an application of equal parts of vinegar and water always anfwered the defired intention. I muft not omit to inform you that when the difeafe had duly acted upon the conftitution, I have frequently ufed the vitriolic acid. A portion of a drop applied with the head of a probe or any convenient utensil upon the pustule suffered to remain about 40 seconds, and afterwards washed off with sponge and water, never failed to stop its progress and expedite the formation of a scab. I have already subjedted 211 of my patients to the action of variolous matter, but every one refitted it. The refult of my experiments, which were made with every requifite caution, has fully convinced me that the true Cow Pox is a fafe and infallible preventive from the Small Pox; that in no cafe which has fallen under my obfervation has it been in any considerable degree troublesome, much lefs have I feen anything like danger, for in no inftance were the patients prevented from following their ordinary employments. In Dr. Woodville's publication on the Cow Pox I noticed an extraordinary fadt. He fays that the generality of his patients had puftules. It certainly appears extremely extraordinary that in all my Cafes there never was but one puftule, which appeared on a patient's elbow on the inoculated arm and maturated. It appeared exactly like that on the incifed part. The whole of my obfervations, founded, as it appears, on an extenfive experience, leads me to thefe obvious conclusions: that thofe Cafes which have been or may be adduced against the preventive powers of the Cow Pox could not have been thofe of the true kind, since it muft appear to be abfolutely impoffible that I should have succeeded in fuch a number of Cafes without a fingle exception, if fuch a preventive power did not exist. I cannot entertain a doubt that the inoculated Cow Pox muft quickly superfede that of Small Pox. If the many important advantages which muft refult from the new practice are duly confidered, we may reafonably infer that public benefit, the fure teft of the real merit of difcoveries, will render it generally extenfive. To you, Sir, as the difcoverer of this highly beneficial practice, mankind are under the higheft obligations. As a private individual I participate in the general feeling, more particularly as you have afforded me an opportunity of noticing the effects of a fingular difeafe, and of viewing the progrefs of the moft curious experiment that ever was recorded in the hiftory of phyfiology. I remain, Dear Sir, etc. Joseph H. Marshall. P.S. I fhould have obferved, that of the patients I inoculated and enumerated in my letter, 127 were infedted with the matter you fent me from the London Cow. I difcovered no diflimilarity of fymptoms in thefe Cafes from thofe which I inoculated from matter procured in this county. No puftules have occurred except in one or two Cafes where a fingle one appeared on the inoculated arm. No difference was apparent in the local inflammation. There was no fufpenfion of ordinary employment among the labouring people, nor was any medicine required. I have frequently inoculated one or two in a family, and the remaining part of it fome weeks afterwards. The uninfedted have flept with the infedted during the whole courfe of the difeafe without feeling it; fo that I am fully convinced the difeafe cannot be taken but by actual contact with the matter. A curious fadt has lately fallen under my obfervation, on which I leave you to comment. I visited a patient with the confluent Small Pox, and charged a lancet with fome of the matter. 2 days afterwards I was desired to inoculate a woman and 4 children with the Cow Pox, and inadvertently took the vaccine matter on the fame lancet which was before charged with that of Small Pox. In 3 days I difcovered the miftake, and fully expedted that my 5 patients would be infedted with Small Pox. But I was agreeably furprized to find the difeafe to be the genuine Cow Pox, which proceeded without deviating in any particular from my former Cafes. I afterwards inoculated thefe patients with variolous matter, but all of them refilled its adtion. I omitted mentioning another great advantage that now occurs to me in the inoculated Cow Pox. I mean the fafety with which pregnant women may have the difeafe communicated to them. I have inoculated a great number of females in that situation, and never observed their cases to differ in any respect from thofe of my other patients. Indeed, the difeafe is fo mild, that it feems as if it might at all times be communicated with the moft perfect fafety." I fhall here take the opportunity of thanking Dr. Marshall and thofe other gentlemen who have obligingly prefented me with the refults of their inoculations; but, as they all agree in the fame point as that given in the above communication, namely, the fecurity of the patient from the effects of the Small Pox after the Cow Pox, their perufal, I prefume, would afford a fatisfaction that has not been amply given already. Particular occurrences I fhall of courfe detail. Some of my correfpondents have mentioned the appearance of Small Pox like eruptions at the commencement of their inoculations; but in thefe cafes the matter was derived from the original ftock at the Small Pox Hofpital. I have myfelf inoculated a very considerable number from the matter produced by Dr. Marfhall's patients, originating in the London Cow, without obferving puftules of any kind, and have difperfed it among others who have used it with a fimilar effect. From this fource Mr. H. Jenner informs me, he has inoculated above 100 patients without obferving eruptions. Whether the nature of the virus will undergo any change from being farther removed from its original fource, in paffing fuccefsfully from one perfon to another, time alone can determine. That which I am now employing has been in ufe near 8 months, and not the leaft change is perceptible in its mode of adlion either locally or conftitutionally. There is therefore every reafon to expect that its effects will remain unaltered, and that we fhall not be under the neceffity of feeking frefh supplies from the cow. The following obfervations were obligingly fent to me by Mr. Tierney, Affiftant Surgeon to the South Gloucester Regiment of Militia, to whom I am indebted for a former report on this fubjedt. "I inoculated with the Cow Pox matter, from the nth to the latter part of April, 25 perfons, including women and children. Some on the nth were inoculated with the matter Mr. Shrapnel, Surgeon to the Regiment, had from you, the others with matter taken from thefe. The progrefs of the puncture was accurately obferved, and its appearance feemed to differ from the Small Pox in having lefs inflammation around its bafis on the firft days, that is, from the 3rd to the 7th, but after this the inflammation increafed, extending on the 10th or 11th day to a circle of an inch and a half from its centre, and threatening very fore arms. But this, I am happy to fay, was not the cafe; for by applying mercurial ointment to the inflamed part, which was repeated daily until the inflammation went off, the arm got well without any further application or trouble. The conftitutional fymptoms which appeared on the 8th or 9th day after inoculation fcarcely deferved the name of difeafe, as they were fo flight as to be barely perceptible, except that I could connect a flight headache and languor with a ftiffness and rather painful fensation in the axilla. This latter fymptom was the moft ftriking. It remained from 12 to 48 hours. In no cafe did I obferve the fmalleft puftule, or even difcoloration of the skin like an incipient puftule, except about the part where the virus had been applied. After all thefe fymptoms had fubfided, and the arms were well, I inoculated 4 of this number with variolous matter, taken from a patient in another regiment. In each of thefe it was inferted feveral times under the cuticle, producing flight inflammation on the 2nd or 3rd day, and always difappearing before the 5th or 6th, except in one who had the Cow Pox in Gloucestershire before he joined us, and who alfo received it at this time by inoculation. In this man the puncture inflamed, and his arm was much forer than from the infertion of the Cow Pox virus. but there was no pain in the axilla, nor could any constitutional affection be observed. I have only to add that I am now fully satisfied of the efficacy of the Cow Pox in preventing the appearance of the Small Pox, and that is a moft happy and falutary subftitute for it. I remain, etc. M. J. Tierney." Although the fusceptibility of the virus of the Cow Pox is for the moft part loft in thofe who have had the Small Pox, yet in fome conftitutions it is only partially deftroyed, and in others it does not appear to be in the leaft diminifhed. By far the greatest number on whom trials were made refilled it entirely, yet I have found fome on whofe arms the puftule, from inoculation, was formed completely, but without producing the common efflorefcent blufh around it, or any conftitutional illnefs, while others have had the difeafe in the moft perfect manner. A cafe of the latter kind having been prefented to me by Mr. Fewster, Surgeon, of Thornbury, I fhall infert it. "3 children were inoculated with the vaccine matter you obligingly fent me. On calling to look at their arms 3 days after, I was told that John Hodges, one of the 3, had been inoculated with the Small Pox when a year old, and that he had a full burthen, of which his face produced plentiful marks, a circumftance I was not before made acquainted with. On the 6th day the arm of this boy appeared as if inoculated with variolous matter, but the puftule was rather more elevated. On the 9th day he complained of violent pain in his head and back, accompanied with vomiting and much fever. The next day he was very well, and went to work as ufual. The punctured part began to spread, and there was an areola around the inoculated part to a considerable extent. As this is contrary to an affertion made in the Medical and Phyfical Journal, No. 8, I thought it right to give you this information, and remain, Dear Sir, etc. J. Fewster." It appears then that the animal economy, with regard to the adtion of this virus, is under the fame laws as it is with refpedt to the variolous virus, after previoufly feeling its influence, as far as comparifons can be made between the two difeafes. Some ftriking inftances of the power of the Cow Pox in fufpending the progrefs of the Small Pox, after the patients had been feveral days cafually expofed to the infection, have been laid before me by Mr. Lyford, Surgeon, of Winchefter, and my nephew, the Rev. G. C. Jenner. Mr. Lyford, after giving an account of his extenfive and fuccefsful practice in the vaccine inoculation in Hampfhire, writes as follows: "The following cafe occurred to me a short time since, and may probably be worth your notice. I was fent for to a patient with the Small Pox, and on inquiry found that, 5 days previous to my feeing him, the eruption began to appear. During the whole of this time, 2 children, who had not had the Small Pox, were conftantly in the room with their father, and frequently on the bed with him. The mother confulted me on the propriety of inoculating them, but objected to my taking the matter from their father, as he was fubjedt to eryfipelas. I advifed her by all means to have them inoculated at that time, as I could not procure any variolous matter elfewhere. However, they were inoculated with vaccine matter, but I cannot fay I flattered myself with its proving fuccefsful, as they had previoufly been fo long, and ftill continued to be, expofed to the variolous infection. Notwithstanding this, I was agreeably furprized to find the vaccine difeafe advance and go through its regular courfe, and if I may be allowed the expreffion, to the total extinction of the Small Pox." Mr. Jenner's Cafes were no lefs satisfactory. He writes as follows: "A fon of Thomas Stinchcombe, of Woodford, near Berkeley, was infedted with the natural Small Pox at Briftol. and came home to his father's cottage. 4 days after the eruptions had appeared on the boy, the family, none of which had ever had the smallpox, consisting of the father, mother, and 5 children, were inoculated with vaccine virus. On the arm of the mother it failed to produce the least effect, and she of course had the smallpox. Under similar circumstances, I think it would be advisable to insert the matter into each arm, which would be more likely to ensure the success of the matter. But the rest of the family had the Cow Pox in the usual mild way, and were not affected with the small pox, although they were in the same room, and the children slept in the same bed with their brother, who was confined to it with the natural small pox, and subsequently with their mother. I attended this family with my brother Mr. H. Jenner." The following Cafes are of too singular a nature to remain unnoticed. Miss R., a young lady about 5 years old, was feized, on the evening of the 8th day after inoculation with vaccine virus, with fuch fymptoms as commonly denote the acceffion of violent fever. Her throat was alfo a little fore, and there were fome uneafy senfations about the mufcles of the neck. The day following a rafh was perceptible on her face and neck, fo much refembling the efflorefcence of the Scarlatina anginofa, that I was induced to ask whether Miss R. had been expofed to the contagion of that difeafe. An anfwer in the affirmative, and the rapid fpreading of the rednefs over the fkin at once relieved me from much anxiety refpedting the nature of the malady, which went through its courfe in the ordinary way, but not without fymptoms which were alarming both to myfelf and Mr. Lyford, who attended with me. There was no apparent deviation in the ordinary progrefs of the puftule to a ftate of maturity, from what we fee in general, yet there was a total fufpenfion of the areola, or florid difcoloration around it, until the Scarlatina had retired from the conftitution. As foon as the patient was freed from this difeafe, this appearance advanced in the ufual way. I witneffed a fimilar fadt in a cafe of meafles. The puftule from the Cow Pox virus advanced to maturity, while the meafles exifted in the conftitution, but no efflorefcence appeared around it until the meafles had ceafed to exert its influence. The cafe of Miss H. R. is not lefs interefting than that of her fifter above related. She was expofed to the contagion of the Scarlatina at the fame time, and fickened almoft at the fame hour. The fymptoms continued fevere about 12 hours, when the scarlatine rafh fhewed itfelf faintly upon her face and partly upon her neck. After remaining 2 or 3 hours it fuddenly difappeared, and fhe became perfectly free from every complaint. My furprife at this fudden tranfition from extreme ficknefs to health, in great meafure ceafed, when I obferved that the inoculated puftule had occafioned, in this cafe, the common efflorefcent appearance around it, and that as it approached the centre it was nearly in an eryfipelatous ftate. But the moft remarkable part of this hiftory is, that on the 4th day afterwards, as foon as the efflorefcence began to die away upon the arm, and the puftule to dry up, the Scarlatina again appeared, her throat became fore, the rafh fpread all over her. She went fairly through the difeafe, with its common fymptoms. That thefe were actually cafes of Scarlatina was rendered certain by 2 fervants in the family falling ill at the fame time with the diftemper, who had been expofed to the infection with the young ladies. Some there are who fuppofe the fecurity from the Small Pox obtained through the Cow Pox will be of a temporary nature only. This fuppofition is refuted, not only by analogy with refpect to the habits of difeafe of a fimilar nature, but by incontrovertible facts, which appear in great numbers against it. To thofe already adduced in the former part of my firft Treatife, many more might be added were it deemed neceffary. But among the cafes I refer to, one will be found of a perfon who had the Cow Pox 53 years before the effect of the Small Pox was tried upon him. As he completely refilled it, the intervening period I conceive muft neceffarily fatisfy any reafonable mind. Should further evidence be thought neceffary, I fhall obferve, that among the cafes prefented to me by Mr. Fry, Mr. Darke, Mr. Tierney, Mr. H. Jenner, and others, there were many whom they inoculated ineffectually with variolous matter, who had gone through the Cow Pox many years before this trial was made. It has been imagined that the Cow Pox is capable of being communicated from one perfon to another by effluvia without the intervention of inoculation. My experiments made with the defign of ascertaining this important point all tend to eftablifh my original pofition, that it is not infectious except by contact. I have never hefitated to fuffer thofe, on whofe arms there were puftules exhaling the effluvia, from affociating or even sleeping with thofe who never had experienced either the Cow Pox or the Small Pox. And further, I have repeatedly, among children, caufed the uninfected to breathe over the inoculated vaccine puftules during their whole progrefs. Yet thefe experiments were tried without the leaft effect. However, to submit a matter fo important to a ftill further scrutiny, I defired Mr. H. Jenner to make any further experiments which might ftrike him as moft likely to eftablifh or refute what has been advanced on this subject. He has fince informed me, that the inoculated children at the breaft, whofe mothers had not gone through either the Small Pox or the Cow Pox, that he had inoculated mothers whofe fucking infants had never undergone either of thefe difeafes, that the effluvia from the inoculated puftules, in either cafe, had been inhaled from day to day during the whole progrefs of their maturation, and that there was not the least perceptible effect from thefe expofures. One woman he inoculated about a week previous to her accouchement, that her infant might be the more fully and conveniently expofed to the puftule, but, as in the former inftances, no infection was given, although the child frequently flept on the arm of its mother, with its nostrils and mouth expofed to the puftule in the fulleft ftate of maturity. In a word, is it not impoffible for the Cow Pox, whofe only manifeftation appears to confift in the puftules created by contact, to produce itself by effluvia? In the courfe of a late inoculation I obferved an appearance which it may be proper here to relate. The punctured part on a boy's arm, who was inoculated with frefh limpid virus, on the 6th day, inftead of fhewing a beginning veficle, which is ufual in the Cow Pox at that period, was encrufted over with a rugged amber coloured scab. The scab continued to spread and increafe in thickness for fome days, when at its edges a veficated ring appeared, and the difeafe went through its ordinary courfe, the boy having had forenefs in the axilla and fome flight indifpofition. With the fluid matter taken from the arm, 5 perfons were inoculated. In one it took no effect. In another it produced a perfect puftule, without any deviation from the common appearance, but in the other 3 the progrefs of the inflammation was exactly fimilar to the inftance which afforded the virus for their inoculation. There was a creeping scab of a loofe texture, and subfequently the formation of limpid fluid at its edges. As thefe people were all employed in laborious exercifes, it is poffible that thefe anomalous appearances might owe their origin to the friction of the clothes on the newly inflamed part of the arm. I have not yet had an opportunity of expofing them to the Small Pox. In the early part of this inquiry I felt far more anxious respecting the inflammation of the inoculated arm than at present, yet that this affection will go on to a greater extent than could be wished, is a circumstance sometimes to be expected. As this can be checked or even entirely subdued by very simple means, I see no reason why the patient should feel an uneasy hour, because an application may not be absolutely necessary. About the 10th or 11th day, if the puftule has proceeded regularly, the appearance of the arm will almost to a certainty indicate whether this is to be expected or not. Should it happen, nothing more need be done than to apply a single drop of the aqua lithargyri acetate (extract of saturn) upon the puftule, and having suffered it to remain 2 or 3 minutes, to cover the efflorefcence surrounding the puftule with a piece of linen dipped in aqua lithargyri composita (Goulard water). For further information on this subject, see the first treatife on the Variolae Vaccinae, Dr. Marshall's Letters, etc. The former may be repeated twice or thrice during the day, the latter as often as it may feel agreeable to the patient. When the scab is prematurely rubbed off, a circumstance not unfrequent among children and working people, the application of a little aqua lithargyri acetate to the part immediately coagulates the surface, which supplies its place and prevents a fore. In my former treatises on this subject, I have remarked that the human constitution frequently retains its susceptibility of the Small Pox contagion, both from effluvia and contact, after previously feeling its influence. In further corroboration of this declaration, many facts have been communicated to me by various correspondents. I fhall select one of them. Dear Sir, Society at large muft, I think, feel much indebted to you for your inquiries and obfervations on the nature and effects of the Variolae Vaccinae, etc. etc. As I conceive what I am now about to communicate to be of fome importance, I imagine it cannot be uninterefting to you, especially as it will ferve to corroborate your affertion on the susceptibility of the human fyftem of the variolous contagion, although it has previously been made fenfible of its action. In November 1793 I was desired to inoculate a perfon with the Small Pox. I took the variolous matter from a child under the difeafe in the natural way, who had a large burden of diftindt puftules. The mother of the child being defirous of feeing my method of communicating the difeafe by inoculation, after having opened a puftule, I introduced the point of my lancet in the ufual way on the back part of my own hand, and thought no more of it until I felt a fenfation in the part, which reminded me of the tranfaction. This happened upon the 3rd day. On the 4th there were all the appearances common to inoculation, at which I was not at all surprised, nor did I feel myself uneafy, upon perceiving the inflammation continued to increafe to the 6th and 7th day, accompanied with a very fmall quantity of fluid. Repeated experiments having taught me it might happen fo with perfons who had undergone the difeafe, and yet would efcape any constitutional affection. But I was not fo fortunate, for on the 8th day I was feized with all the fymptoms of the eruptive fever, but in a much more violent degree than when I was before inoculated, which was about 18 years previous to this, when I had a considerable number of puftules. I muft confefs I was now greatly alarmed, although I had been much engaged in the Small Pox, having at different times inoculated not lefs than 2000 perfons. I was convinced that my present indifpofition proceeded from the infertion of the variolous matter, and therefore anxioufly looked for an eruption. On the 10th day I felt a very unpleafant fenfation of ftiffness and heat on each fide of my face near the ear, and the fever began to decline. The affection in my face soon terminated in 3 or 4 puftules attended with inflammation, but which did not maturate, and I was presently well. I remain, Dear Sir, etc. Thomas Miles." This inquiry is not now so much in its infancy as to reftrain me from speaking more positively than formerly on the important points of scrofula, as connected with the Small Pox. Every practitioner in medicine who has extensively inoculated with the Small Pox, or who has attended many of thofe who have had the diftemper in the natural way, muft acknowledge that he has frequently feen scrofulous affections, in fome form or another, fometimes rather quickly fhewing themfelves after the recovery of the patients. Conceiving this fadt to be admitted, as I prefumed it muft be by all who have carefully attended to the subject, may I not ask whether it does not appear probable that the general introduction of the Small Pox into Europe has not been among the moft conducive means in exciting that formidable foe to health? Having attentively watched the effects of the Cow Pox in this refpect, I am happy in being able to declare that the difeafe does not appear to have the leaft tendency to produce this deftructive malady. The scepticifm that appeared even among the moft enlightened of medical men when my sentiments on the important fubject of the Cow Pox were firft promulgated, was highly laudable. To have admitted the truth of a doctrine, at once fo novel and fo unlike any thing that had ever appeared in the annals of medicine, without the teft of the moft rigid fcrutiny, would have bordered upon temerity; but now, when that scrutiny has taken place, not only among ourfelves but in the firft profefsional circles in Europe, and when it has been uniformly found in fuch abundant inftances that the human frame, when once it has felt the influence of the genuine Cow Pox in the way that has been defcribed, it is never afterwards, at any period of its existence, affailable by the Small Pox, may I not with perfect confidence congratulate my country and society at large on their beholding, in the mild form of the Cow Pox, an antidote that is capable of extirpating from the earth a difeafe which is every hour devouring its victims, a difeafe that has ever been considered as the fevereft fcourge of the human race. Finis. End of Section 4. End of an Inquiry into the Caufes and Effects of the Variolae Vaccinae, by Edward Jenner.